Rajabe. In this video we're going to be doing the complete Skyrim versus Dragon Age. Now the purpose of this video isn't to say which game is worse and which game is better, it's to look at all three games, Skyrim, Dragon Age Origins, Dragon Age 2, comparatively, to see what strengths and what weaknesses come out of each game's chosen format. Now Skyrim we're going to be looking at as an open world fantasy simulation, Dragon Age Origins we're going to be looking at as a traditionally styled Dungeons & Dragons kind of role-playing game, and Dragon Age 2 we're going to be looking at as an experimental sort of contemporary television-based approach. Now, I wrote the video with all three of those games being looked at together, but I certainly don't have an expectation that you're going to sit down for 2 entire hours and listen to me talk about them. So, to that end, I've broken down the video into its different sections down in the table of contents by timestamp. You can just go down there and switch to whatever game you want to do. So let's get started. Let's start with Skyrim. Skyrim is one of those games that people just can't get out of their head. Much more so than even Oblivion, the Elder Scrolls title that preceded Skyrim. Skyrim was a commercial and critical success that guaranteed Bethesda a place among the very top role-playing studios working today. But it's also widely criticized for being shallow, and in many ways, a tremendous oversimplification of the role-playing genre. And in many ways, it is both shallow and simple. Shallow in its human interactions and plot, the traditional meat of the Western role-playing experience, and simple in the ways that it requires the player to interact with the world and the game's numbers system. What's remarkable about Skyrim is that it does not need these areas to be robust and well-developed to work. It's chosen to completely focus on the player as a player, autonomous and apart from the game's world, and the way it draws the player into that experience is nothing short of brilliant. When we talk about Dragon Age later on, we'll talk about how the player character is constructed as a specific person in a specific situation, the hero of Ferelden, the champion of Kirkwall. In those games, you're defined by those events, and your role in them. In Skyrim, you may be partially driven by circumstance. You are the long-foretold Dragonborn, able to speak the language of the ancient dragons, but that has absolutely zero hold over you as an actor in the events of the game. You are always player one. In this way, you don't really play a role in Skyrim, not like in tabletop role-playing influence design doctrines. Here, it's just you as you in the role of you with a sword. Like Oblivion before it, the genius of Skyrim is in its knowledge of itself as a game, and its total commitment to the technical construction of the game world as you experience it sitting on your couch, hands on the controller. The thing is, this isn't a revolutionary idea. There have always been two schools of role-playing design. One says the gameplay should drive the construction of the world, a la Blizzard with Diablo and World of Warcraft, and Bethesda with the Elder Scrolls titles and its modern Fallout game. The second says that the writing and the design of the quests should take precedence, a la BioWare and Obsidian. Sometimes a studio will split the difference. Black Isle, back in the day, produced both the story-focused Baldur's Gate series and the gameplay-driven Icewind Dale series using the same game engine, but marketed to different gamers looking for those distinct areas of emphasis. Bethesda farmed a quest-driven Fallout to the developer Obsidian with Fallout New Vegas, partly as an olive branch to longtime series fans, but also partly to capture that segment of the gaming market. Skyrim, however, makes no compromise or apologies. Skyrim is the latest in a long lineage of role-playing games that make player freedom, the ability of the player to go where they want, do what they want, and physically manipulate the world how they want, as the primary concern. Choosing to make that goal such a priority over other goals, like deep NPCs or branching plot consequences, shifts the game's overall aesthetic away from classic D&D style role-playing and deep into the unique concerns of an open-world simulation. A digital model of classic Western high fantasy, like how Grand Theft Auto V is a digital model of how American pop culture perceives Southern California to be. And that's not a bad thing, to be more of a simulation than a role-playing title. Skyrim is without a doubt one of the finest fantasy simulations ever constructed. Skyrim's construction is almost identical to Oblivion and Fallout 3 in many respects. So why is it better? The first and possibly most important answer is the environment, particularly the landscape. The kingdom of Skyrim, as portrayed in the game, is both massively ambitious and cleverly arranged, dividing this northern land into 8 environmentally distinct holds, with their own cities, settlements, and local concerns. The look of Skyrim changes quite tremendously between the holds, but unlike Oblivion, which shifted the environments jarringly and awkwardly, Skyrim eases the player in and out of numerous beautiful terrains, mostly through use of mountains, using altitude shifts and obscuring peaks to reduce and nearly eliminate the kind of patchwork look of the previous game Cyrodiil. And all the holds share a European flavor that unifies them. There's no swamps or jungles mixed in with everything else. I'd like to really stress what an accomplishment Skyrim is as a digital world. Every roll of the hills and dip of the valleys was placed with obvious care, consideration, and thought towards making the world look alive and vibrant from any angle. The way plant life, wildlife, and weather are all integrated makes Skyrim's primary activity, which is walking, consistently entertaining. The seemingly effortless natural beauty of the artificial kingdom Bethesda created is probably the number one thing that makes the game world work so well. Now, that's not just graphics I'm applauding, not just the textures and the particle effects, which are also quite wonderfully and naturalistically done. It's the overwhelming amount of work that went into crafting the world in a way that continually beckons the player to continue exploring, offering both diversions and obvious routes from everywhere to everywhere that I want to single out for being praiseworthy. For open-world design, it is a stunning success. Aesthetically, it gives a stronger illusion of placefulness than any RPG I have ever played. In terms of gameplay, it's carefully tooled to allow the player to go anywhere and do anything without feeling constrained, something that I did not think could be accomplished purely by being clever with the use of rocks and fog, but here we are. The above-ground world, Skyrim itself, is the game's greatest strength. But it's the below-ground world that most distinguishes itself from Oblivion. Oblivion also had hundreds of optional dungeons and incidental areas, not to mention the Oblivion Gates, but Oblivion's dungeons had a frustrating sameness to them, a kind of obvious dungeon template that, after a while, you couldn't help but begin to resent. A lot of people felt that way, enough that Skyrim designers specifically set out to make each of these still hundreds of optional areas feel unique and handcrafted, with more of a sense of specific history to them. Now, there's only a handful of different types of dungeon in Skyrim. The ancient Nordic ruin, the natural cave, the Dwemer, or Dwarven if you prefer ruin, Fort Castle. Now, Oblivion had a similar number of base dungeon sets, but it didn't spend half the effort that Skyrim does blending the sets and giving them twists, as well as filling them with a lot more side and miscellaneous quests than Oblivion ever did. If you play for long enough, you may still get fatigued by the lack of fundamental variety, but the extra care put into the dungeons is obvious and deeply impressive. It's really important that the locations you visit so frequently have self-contained stories and histories. That contributes a lot to staving off the inevitable feeling of impatience that marks the end of most people's journey in the game. What's a little strange is how Bethesda, here as in previous Elder Scrolls games, actually conveys the history and culture of Skyrim. They do it in a way that leaves a strong immediate impression, and then figure if you care enough about it, you can go and literally find a book and look up a deeper explanation. Each city in Skyrim has its own very distinct look and tone, but that's all conveyed through the architecture. Likewise, the lost civilizations of the ancient Nords and the Dwemer. It's all about the look of them. Bethesda is amazing at that. They did the same thing with Fallout 3, using art and symbolic cues to tune the player into the exact sort of vibe that they want to convey, without having to explain very much through exposition. There's a ton of exposition in the game anyway, but it's mostly hidden away in books. During your travels in Skyrim, you'll encounter dozens upon dozens of histories, legends, stories, journals, and catalogs that can really broaden your understanding of Skyrim the place. That's if you have the patience for them, though. Some, like the Wolf Queen series, are pretty fun reads that add a nice feeling of cultural background to the world. Others, like the Dwemer Inquiries that go into vague detail about the lost civilization, are interesting but unsatisfying, relying pretty heavily on the "no one can really know the true secrets of the lost dwarven civilizations" card to get out of having to explain too heavily. But architecturally, the Dwemer ruins are arranged in ways that suggest real, workable living arrangements, and there's a nice sense of realism to them, even if they are frustratingly enigmatic. A lot of the books are, frankly, kind of boring and not very well written. That they are there at all is complementary to the game, but in general, the books of Skyrim, if you read enough of them, contribute to the creeping sensation you get interacting with the NPCs of the world. That the construction of Skyrim as an invented culture is pretty much just a function of what the simulation needs to keep the player interested. Most people never read the books, and I don't blame anyone for it. That's not where the fun of the game is. But if you don't, Skyrim can seem like a really vaguely defined world, relying mostly on a player's pre-existing familiarity with fantasy cliches and game expectations, instead of going out of its way to establish its private mythos. You're given just enough plot to justify what you're doing at any given moment, no more, no less. And if you aggressively pursue any individual plotline, they usually only take a handful of hours apiece to complete. The werewolf plotline of the Companions, for example, is interesting, but relies really heavily on a competent, stable, but very predictable pacing and execution. The main plot is actually quite short if you do it late in the game, and especially so if you've got the Dawnguard expansion. The only real reason that the main plot takes so long is that it requires you to solve alternate plot lines, like issues with Skyrim Civil War and tracking down some Elder Scrolls. It's only a couple hours of the actual game, and this is a 100-plus hour game if you really get into it. The Civil War portion of the game is one of its better, with ramifications that really do affect the whole of Skyrim, even if you're only making a binary choice between the occupying Imperials and the native Stormcloaks. And your battle for your chosen side takes you to almost every part of the landscape. A lot of the most important and the most fun major quests are arranged this way. Multi-part goals that force you to explore new parts of the world, offering an incredible variety of diversions. And the diversions are where the game really shines. One-off quests, self-contained stories that tap into a mood or a feeling, rather than a real meaty story. That's not to say there are no well-written quests or no interesting characters. There are. The various factions and their leaders are well done and well portrayed, but your interactions with them are very surface level. You don't really get to know, say, the leader of the Greybeards, but the game's writing leaves you with the impression that you do. It's a game where costume, accent, and pre-existing player expectations shape the kind of person you're interacting with. Unlike Dragon Age, your character will never have friends in Skyrim, just a limitless sea of vague acquaintances. They make sense and function well. Blacksmiths come across as blacksmiths, shopkeepers like shopkeepers, royalty like royalty. But if you're going to really enjoy Skyrim, that has to be a satisfactory stopping point for how meaningful your interaction with those characters is going to be. Bethesda is better at crafting situations than people anyway, so many of the quests are still tons of fun, even if the characters are shallow. When the quests work, they work so wonderfully and charismatically that it is hard to resist the pull of chaining them together, trying to finish just one more until you're falling asleep sitting up and get absolutely murdered by bears. Oblivion didn't have nearly as many defined quests and goals, and it was harder to engage with Cyrodiil than Skyrim on account of it. The game is so truly massive, and the number of objectives you're juggling at any given time is so large that it would be easy to get totally overwhelmed if it weren't for all those quest markers giving their quiet reassurance to the player. Even if most of the quests are inter-dungeon, find item, return item, they have so many varieties of dungeons and items that it's consistently engaging for hours on top of hours. The game's Daedric quests are particular standouts, and they mark the most creative departures from the standard fantasy setting in the game, as well as some of its most memorable moments. Plus, you're given the unique and useful items as rewards, and the satisfaction of interacting with a fascinatingly characterized pantheon of divine jerks. I honestly don't know why the Elder Scrolls series in general doesn't orient in these weird, wild directions that the artists and writers at Bethesda obviously excel at going in more often. You'll see it more in the Dragonborn expansion, much like the amazing Shivering Isles expansion for Oblivion. But Skyrim, generally, is mired in fantasy cliché. It works well for the simulation, but it becomes a little frustrating once you catch on to the fact that Bethesda could be doing much more interesting stuff if they were willing to just run with it. But being interesting was not as important to Bethesda as being malleable was. All these quests, good or bad, are designed to be played in any order without breaking the game. There's a lot of ways to play Skyrim as a consequence. You can tackle quests region by region and long one-direction chains of exploration in loops, going from mountaintop to mountaintop, or completely randomly. You can play this damn game in absolutely any order you can dream of, and what's genius about the way Skyrim is written is not in any line of dialogue, which are generally pretty bad, or any individual character, which are pretty universally shallow and utilitarian, but in how absolutely fluid and flexible the entire structure of plot is. While it's good to follow the main plot right up until the point where dragons first appear, so you can get rolling on your dragon shouts and such, after that it is one of the most functional, truly open worlds you'll ever encounter in a game. Go to the opposite end of the map and do nothing but cave diving for 20 hours, then join the Mages Guild, then become a vampire, then become a werewolf, then go back to cave diving, then choose a new High King of Skyrim, and when you finally come back to the main plot, nothing will be broken, and all of your decisions will be accommodated. This, more than anything else, is why you have such shallow choices as a player, and such a vague character in the Dragonborn, because without that shallowness, the flexibility of plot would require some extremely complicated ways to reconcile any more player choice than it already has. And the words extremely complicated translate in game development into many months and many thousands of dollars. Besides, Bethesda games have been using this Occam's RPG conversation approach for years, and people dig it. I dig it. It works very well for Skyrim, and that's directly because of Bethesda's choice to make the player the only meaningful character in the game. The vast majority of the game is spent out in caves, forests, and ruins. The time you spend with other characters is really minimal for a AAA title, particularly compared with Dragon Age. That's the Skyrim experience. The leveling system has also been criticized for being shallow, but it isn't. It's cleverly crafted to fit the player-centric experience. Performing specific actions levels up the skill in that action, and when you've performed enough actions, you're given a perk point and a general character level up, rather than receiving general experience from which you can freely invest. You receive no XP from quests, and you have no statistics like strength or dexterity, just your health, your magic, your stamina, and your skills. The perk trees give your skills bonuses and special areas of focus that help make the things you do most often in the game easier, so that by the time you're getting tired of the game, you're progressing through it much faster. And that is brilliant design. It's rare to see a statistic system that contributes to a game's pacing, but Skyrim has one. Similarly, the economy of Skyrim and how the player interacts with it monetarily is quite clever. As is traditional in Bethesda games, vendors only have a finite amount of cash on hand, and at first will only buy items similar to that which they sell. What this means for the player is that it is a lot less convenient to amass a fortune than in other RPGs, and much slower going trying to do so. You have to be judicious about how you loot, what you choose to carry, what sorts of exchanges you want to make. You're forced to rely on genuine barter most of the time, with gold evening out the edges of a transaction. As such, a player's progress is economically stunted until, again, way later in the game when you're beginning to grow bored with it. The number systems of Skyrim aren't lacking just because they don't conform to the multi-page character sheets of old. They are to be applauded for accommodating the psychology of the player in their most basic concepts and workings. That is quite sophisticated. Since Skyrim is designed to allow the plot to be played so randomly, haphazardly, and inconsistently, it cannot depend on the plot for a sense of beginning, middle, and end. That arc has to be expressed through the player character themselves, and I am deeply personally impressed that Bethesda came up with a way to let the player experience that sensation numerically and functionally, rather than descriptively or through plot. So, what do you get for the kingdom that has everything, then? Dawnguard, the first expansion for Skyrim, answered that question with a resounding more of the same, and then delivered quite winningly. It's complimentary that Skyrim had 2 actual expansion packs as opposed to a big bag of DLC, and Dawnguard adds a couple large areas to the game world and focuses on an extremely trite and campy story of a vampire family and an ancient prophecy. Early on, you join the legendary Dawnguard, vampire hunters of great repute. Then you meet the vampire Serena, and through some painfully bad exposition learn that she and her mother just wanted to be a happy family of bloodthirsty vampires, but that her father, Lord Harkon, wasn't satisfied and became obsessed with some prophecy about allowing vampires to walk in the sun once more. If you're thinking, that sounds familiar, you're right. It's only the same plot components as slightly over half of every vampire story from the past couple decades. It's dumb, it comes across as dumb, it's hard to care about it, but Dawnguard is still fun, because it is the structure of questing in Skyrim, not the substance, that makes it enjoyable. And Dawnguard's quests are extremely well done, having taken careful note of what works best in a Skyrim quest. You'll start off with some "we're getting the band back together" stuff that takes you all across the continent of Skyrim, and then, later on, you'll venture deep into Harkon's castle to find Serena's mother. What you find instead is a gateway to the Soul Cairn, a brand new plane of oblivion that constitutes one of the most artistically interesting parts of the entire Skyrim experience. It's truly otherworldly, and knowing that all of this shit is going on behind the ubiquitous soul gem system you use for enchanting gives a little extra kick to your playthrough. Plus, they acquaint you with an undead dragon that you can summon to fight beside you for the remainder of the game. After the Soul Cairn, the other major new area is the Forgotten Vale, where you learn a lot of great backstory about the Falmer, the weird underground elf-like creatures you'd encountered in the main game. Turns out that they're the mysterious and long-missing Snow Elves who once ruled Skyrim, twisted into their current form by the Dwemer, who also mysteriously disappeared, but that disappearance remains mysterious. It's a beautiful and massive area, designed with a keen eye for aesthetics, discovery, and player reward. Dawnguard also adds a number of new quests to the main map of Skyrim, most notably a Dwemer archaeology quest called Lost to the Ages, at the end of which you forge a powerful new item in a gorgeous and ancient ruin. Finally, at the end, when you stop Harkon, it goes down exactly like you'd expect. No surprises, no creativity. Just old vampire trope after old vampire trope until the bleeding is over and the day is won. Of course, you can also join the vampires when you first meet Harkon, in which case it's the Dawnguard fortress you'll be assaulting instead. But whichever choice you make, you can see it coming a mile away the minute they start trying to hint at it. This expansion is knitted into the fabric of the main game in a remarkably seamless way, though, and if you're starting a new game from scratch, you'll find that you don't even have the sensation of playing additional content. It just feels like a particularly dense Skyrim experience. Dawnguard highlights everything that's right with Skyrim, like beautiful artistic quality, careful and professional level design, and an addictive questing structure, but it also highlights everything that's wrong with Skyrim, like paint-by-numbers plotting and paper-thin characters. Bethesda must have picked up on that vibe, seeing as the next expansion, Dragonborn, is tremendously creative. It gives you a whole island to explore, Solstheim, appearing again for the first time since Morrowind, the third Elder Scrolls game. The island is pretty small, and while there's parts of it that are certainly scenic and beautiful, like the great volcano in the distance and the Dunmer settlement made from enormous mushrooms, in general, the island is not where the visual focus of Dragonborn is. Dragonborn is all about the H.P. Lovecraft vibe. The plot of Dragonborn is that long ago, the very first Dragonborn was a fella named Marac. Marac was taught a shout by Hermaeus Mora, the Lovecraftian Daedric lord of knowledge and destiny. Marac tried to rebel against the dragons, failed, and has spent many millennia inside Mora's own plane of oblivion, Apocrypha. But now he's reaching out through dreams to force the population of Solstheim to build the monuments that will bring him back to the real world. Mora doesn't take kindly to this, and demands his death. You oblige. That's the whole plot, besides a handful of quick and entertaining side quests. So, Dragonborn is short, it's simple, but at least it is original. And even if they are principally just stealing from Lovecraft and designing Apocrypha, it is still one of the most memorable and amazing parts of the entire game. Apocrypha is aggressively exotic and confusing, much to the benefit of the player. Dragonborn is designed to be played toward the end of your Skyrim experience, and by the time you're trucking through it, you may be starting to feel like if you have to stick your nose in one more ancient Nordic barrow, you are going to completely lose your shit. So the first time you pick up one of the half-dozen black books and it reaches out with tentacles to pull you into its shadowy and alien world, it is impossible not to get stoked on it. Lovecraft, if you're not familiar, was an early 20th century horror writer who had a particular flair for writing stories in which the horror stems from confronting things that are completely beyond the scope of human comprehension, frequently featuring uncaring and cruel beings lording over twisted, impossible landscapes, eventually driving mad those who saw too much. If you read Lovecraft, it's a little annoying how much he weasels out of specific description with a glib, "The madness is too mad, and I cannot, nor can any man, truly describe what is so creepy about it besides its overwhelming creepiness, but trust me, dear reader, that it is some fucked up shit." So it's no real wonder that his aesthetic has found such a comfortable home in the digital medium, which is particularly suited to painting a detailed portrait of what the man himself would typically only allude to. Bethesda actually has some great credentials for adapting Lovecraft to video games already, having released Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth back in 2005, an excellent mashup of some of Lovecraft's most famous short stories, told as a first-person adventure game. In Dragonborn, it's mostly just some of the visual themes of Lovecraft they've adapted and hybridized with Mora's Daedric role as Lord of Knowledge and Destiny, filling the world of Apocrypha with continents of books weathered by an oily sea. The result is jaw-droppingly gorgeous, and the time you spend in the black books is too short. Each book is like a maze with different levels or chapters, and when you get to the end, you're given a permanent stat bonus of your choice. Once you get the rhythm of the black books, they're pretty easy, particularly for high-level characters, but damned if they aren't some of the best that Skyrim has to offer. I'd love to see more done with these B-list Daedric realms, which are so wildly interesting, rather than Oblivion's pretty standard take on a hellscape. It's a very satisfying expansion pack altogether. It feels fun, fresh, and the wicked fast pace you can cruise through it really helps alleviate endgame irritability and impatience. When you get back to the main continent, though, you're faced with the fact that Skyrim's endgame is pretty much endless. It isn't. You'll probably be able to do everything in the game within a few hundred hours, but it takes an enormous commitment to even consider putting in that amount of time. For some, the feeling of really being part of Skyrim, of its land, its people, its landscape, is extremely meaningful, and for those people, there's also the Hearthfire DLC, which adds in options for players to purchase land, build houses, and raise a family of sorts. For these players, it is of little consequence that the story of Skyrim is told so vaguely. It is their story, and their ownership of the story gives it much greater definition than for a player unmoved by the simulation. The vast majority of players, however, will find a moment where they're ready to throw in the towel on the Dragonborn and go play something different. And that's sort of the end of Skyrim, the getting tired of it. It's not really a great way to end a game, but it's a consequence of making a game so genuinely open and so fully simulated. The next installment of the Elder Scrolls series will be a massively multiplayer one, the upcoming subscription-based Elder Scrolls Online. Set millennia before Skyrim, it'll give the player access, over time and through expansions, to damn near all of Tamriel, the complete world of the Elder Scrolls series. Looking at Skyrim, at its strengths and at its challenges, it seems quite obvious to me that an MMO is the next logical progression for the series, and a sensible one as well. The shallow characters, the sense of endless variations within a defined set of possibilities, the focus on numerical and functional growth shaping the player's perception of their characters, this is all MMO territory. And with other players there to add life to the experience of being part of Tamriel, the game can overcome the awkwardness of its NPCs. It's a good choice. And it's a good challenger for reigning champ World of Warcraft, a naturalistic, serious counterbalance to WoW's bright colors and casual tone. I think it's good for the long-term health of the Elder Scrolls series. I think it's good for the long-term health of the MMO genre. Besides, it also takes the Elder Scrolls out of a direct competition with its biggest rival fantasy universe, the universe of Dragon Age. So after having seen what you can really accomplish with a simulation looking at Skyrim, let's look at what happens when you take all the tools of contemporary game making and turn them toward the traditional Dungeons & Dragons influenced role-playing style. Dragon Age Origins is a huge game, and it's going to take a while to cover, but it's going to be worthwhile to take a look into its characters, its culture, and its construction. Let's start. 2009's Dragon Age Origins was, at the time of its release, a highly ambitious next-generation take on the old-school pen-and-paper-influenced fantasy adventure. It would be, in terms of design, a direct successor to Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights, but ditching Dungeons & Dragons' Forgotten Realms setting in favor of a brand-new, deeply thought-out fantasy universe that BioWare could retain total creative control over. Mass Effect, BioWare's other big RPG franchise, was all about action, immediate reaction, and featured a fully voiced main character whose conversation you steered rather than directly controlled. So when it came down to making Dragon Age Origins, the company could safely go retro in designing the game. Having a slower-paced, tactical, incredibly lore-heavy traditional fantasy RPG alongside Mass Effect's gunplay and contemporary production allowed BioWare to completely saturate the RPG market at the time and appeal to many different types of gamers. It was great business then to make Dragon Age as traditional as it is. But the RPG market has changed a lot in the past couple of years, a lot of that change driven by BioWare itself, and it's not likely that an experience as truly epic and huge as Dragon Age will be told in a way so authentically faithful to the tabletop experience again. The classic RPG won't ever go away, indie developers will make sure of that, but a heavyweight developer devoting this much money to produce this much content in this dated a format is not likely to happen again anytime soon. The grand tradition of D&D influenced design may have had its last great moment in the sun with Origins, but my god, what a moment it was. Traditional role-playing is linear role-playing. The environments are limited, the plot follows a definitive arc, and in many cases the general order of plot is somewhat predetermined, and player freedom, the kind of freedom Skyrim offered, is limited. In place of player freedom, however, is an actual role-playing experience, where what the player is chiefly in charge of determining isn't so much where to go and what to do from amongst dozens of options, but how to react to the narrative, the characters, and the innumerable interactions between them. With Skyrim, as an open-world fantasy simulation, any given moment of the game is pretty much as meaningful as any other, since the only important plot arc is the one determined by the player. Wherever you go, that's where you are, and it's all pretty fun. Its plot is too decentralized to be otherwise. Origins, on the other hand, leverages a linear plot for all it's worth, pulling the player along through decisions and experiences larger and more powerful than the player themselves, forcing choice, encouraging thoughtfulness, and giving a truly satisfying range of reactions to the situations it presents. You know, role-playing. Origins is designed with nods toward player freedom, and divided its plot to be extremely modular and adaptable within certain limits. So while you can solve the big-ticket quests in whatever order you choose, you're still following a pretty straight-shot path through those quests when you get to them. Origins, like any old-school RPG worth its salt, takes the limited, relatively predetermined march through the game's areas and events and then hinges it in dozens and dozens of places, giving the player meaningful choice regarding the fates of the people, places, and goings-on that the player encounters, accumulating, over the course of the game, a mountain of decisions that play out over the climax and reactively with one another. To be honest, if someone asked me to describe Dragon Age Origins in one sentence, it would be this. Origins is the best choose-your-own-adventure novel ever written. It's not about your experience as Player 1. It's about your experience constructing the personality and story of the Grey Warden. Now, the game is called Origins for two reasons. One being that it's the launch of a new intellectual property that BioWare has had huge ambitions for from the very start, and second, because the game begins with a prologue in which the origin of your character before the events of the plot kick into gear is told. You're given a whole half-dozen background options, mostly choosing between coming from a privileged or marginalized class background between the elves, humans, and dwarves, with a separate origin for the mages. I played through a lot of them, and they're all pretty amazing, with ramifications special to your background occurring continually throughout the plot. For example, if you choose the human noble background, a man named Rendon Howe will kill your entire family in a political coup. Later, when you encounter him in Denerim, you'll have special dialogue regarding the crimes that a character of a different background wouldn't have. I chose the Dalish elf background for this video's playthrough, and I'm glad I did, because it had by far the greatest feeling of continuity of any of the origin stories, and the greatest connection to the plot of the DLCs and later games. Plus, playing an elf, you run into some of the most interesting writing and world-building choices in the game, namely, most humans in Dragon Age are incredibly racist towards elves, and you've got to figure out how to play your status as a disliked minority. It's probably one of the most clever handlings of actual racial issues I've seen in a game, since it divorces the player's experience of racism from color, using the elves' physiology as a lightning rod for discrimination. A character in the game will call you a lazy, worthless knife-ear. They'll tell you deserve to be poor, to be hated, they'll spit on you. A contemporary audience knows what word knife-ear would be in the real world. It doesn't take a genius to figure out, but it's handled very deftly, and that it takes the game's predominantly white male audience and confronts them with the kind of casual racism that they might not notice just going through their daily lives. The depth of the parallel between Dragon Age's elves and the minority experience is, if we're going to be honest, pretty shallow, but it's there. It's arguable that it might be in slightly poor taste to have discrimination gamified in this way. The first time you get a "what do you mean, you people" response to select, you've got to decide for yourself if you're going to take the high road or have fun with your class status, what fun there is to be had in it anyway. Even if it is tasteless to have fun with themes that so severely impact people in the real world, it does highlight just how meaningless racism is as a concept. All the stereotypes about elves that abound in the culture of Dragon Age are just as untrue and worthless as all the stereotypes about marginalized folks here in the United States. This theme reaches its most charismatic zenith in a series of conversations with Leliana, one of your companions, who will treat your elf character with quite a bit of casual racism in a, "wait, I didn't mean it that way," or "I sort of did, but I didn't want to offend you" kind of way, and the player can decide to roll with it or explain to her just how ignorant she's being. Whatever origin story you choose, you'll be recruited by a man named Duncan to join the ranks of a group called the Grey Wardens, a small and slightly mysterious order dedicated to fighting the Darkspawn, an irredeemably evil race of creatures that, as legend has it, were created when mages from the Devinter Imperium attempted to reach the Maker's Golden City, heaven, basically, and corrupted it with their touch, forever cursing them. When an ancient dragon, tainted by the blood of the Darkspawn, wakes from their thousands of years of slumber, a blight begins. A Darkspawn crusade to kill everything in their path, led by the dragon, called an archdemon. Your character is needed because a blight may be coming. Grey Wardens are special because they carry some of the Darkspawn's essence within them, called the Taint, which allows them special insight into the Darkspawn and grants them immunity to the poison in the Darkspawn's veins. In the Dalish origin story, you encountered the Taint early through contact with an Eluvian, an ancient and magical mirror used to communicate long distances, a kind of magic that dates back to when the Devinter mages first tried to take the Maker's Golden City and were cast down. If you don't become a Grey Warden, you'll die. So you leave the nomadic life you've always known for the battle at Ostagar. The Ostagar sequence serves as the game's real introduction to the world of Dragon Age, setting the scene incredibly well. You'll be introduced to the culture and conflicts that you'll spend the rest of the game experiencing, like the dangerous and volatile nature of magic, the medieval politics of Heraldon, the cruel nature of the Darkspawn and the Blight, and you'll begin to get into the real meat of Dragon Age, the companion characters that constitute your adventuring party. First, you'll meet Alistair, an ex-Templar and secret heir to the throne of Denerim. Alistair is a phenomenal companion character. He's consistently funny, but in a very believable way, and during the serious parts of his character's story arc, a subplot that could come off as hackneyed and contrived quite easily, Steve Valentine's winning vocal performance sells the scenario and the situation totally. You also meet Morrigan, daughter of the infamous Witch of the Wilds. Morrigan is famous in video game circles for being one of the best-written women NPCs in gaming, and for having one of the better romantic subplots in gaming, rightly so on both counts. Again, it's partly because of the script itself and partly the voice acting. Morrigan is voiced by Claudia Black, who many of you may remember as Erin Soon on the extremely memorable sci-fi TV show Farscape. Much of this introduction has you seeking out a set of ancient Grey Warden treaties that you'll spend the rest of the game using to compel various groups to help stop the Blight. The other thing you'll need is the blood of the Darkspawn for the ritual that will induct you permanently into the ranks of the Grey Wardens, your old life erased as your person becomes indistinguishable from your office. The joining ritual is one of my favorite scenes in gaming history, and it sets the tone for what you'll see consistently throughout Dragon Age. Unexpected depth in the vocal work, natural use of a wide range of emotions, fascinating lore presented in a convincing and memorable way. The joining is the Dragon Age experience in a nutshell. I don't usually do this, but I'm going to let it play out in the video so that we can all be on the same page about what this game is really about.
Davith, step forward. I am sorry, Davith. Step forward, Jory.
But I have a wife, a child. Had I known...
There is no turning back.
No! You ask too much. There is no glory in this.
I am sorry. But the joining is not yet complete. You are called upon to submit yourself to the taint for the greater good. From this moment forth, you are a Grey Warden. It is finished. Welcome.
Do you see what I mean? This is solid fantasy writing for any medium, solid acting work for any AV medium. Origins is too large of a game to maintain this level of competence for its entire duration, but at its best, it's this good or better, and at its worst, it's still worthwhile entertainment. After the joining, it's time for disaster, betrayal, and the beginning of your journey as the Grey Warden. The young and naive King Cailan, alongside Duncan, are left for dead when the pretty classically dastardly Taron Loghain withdraws from the field so he can return to Denerim, the capital city, and seize the throne. Loghain's story arc is the most cliché part of Origins. He's such a hammy villain, and with the game so abundantly creative in other areas, you'd think that the main antagonist would be a little more fleshed out. He does get rounded out a bit, much later in the game. You can even recruit him into the Grey Wardens at the climax, but while his motivations are reasonable, they're still not very creative. After the battle, Flemeth, a truly legendary figure within the world of Dragon Age, and certainly one of its most engaging, lays clear the path before the Grey Warden. Your character in Alistair may be the last of your order, but it is only by your willingness to stand and unite the kingdom that any hope can remain. High stakes, a noble goal, a murky path to get there, surprises and constant intrigue around every corner. It's a phenomenal way to kick off the bulk of the game, which consists of two principal activities: growing your party and getting to know your companions, and accumulating consequences based on your decisions as a character. First, let's talk about the adventuring party. The party is the core of the Western role-playing game. It's always been the core, because back in tabletop days, the party would be played by your actual flesh-and-blood friends, populated by whatever they could dream of. Tabletop games are very freeform and reactive because what you're principally playing with is your imagination, and your imagination has an impressive draw distance. Video games are much more limited because they can only contain the options that are within the game's ability and budget to show you. Video games are not suited to allow more than one person to roleplay at a time. Those of you who've played the Old Republic MMO know how limiting it is to the role-playing experience to try and accommodate the decisions of multiple free-willed people. So instead of your friends, you have these NPCs. What's so charming about the BioWare style of RPG, however, is that these NPCs are your character's friends. Not the player's friends, but the character's friends. And the player can enjoy this feeling of camaraderie vicariously. BioWare is hugely talented at this, writing companion characters who feel vivid, dynamic, and real. Origins has a particularly well-balanced ensemble cast, with characters who range from moral to amoral, but who never come across as demagogues for their causes. On the traditionally good end of the spectrum, you've got Alistair, Wynne, and Leliana. Alistair, as we have discussed, is great comic relief, but when the plot draws him in and forces him to be king, or not, depending on how you want it to go down, you really see how problematic and hard that is for Alistair. Really feel his distaste for power. It's really well done. Wynne is a senior enchanter for the Mages Circle, who you first meet at Ostagar and then again at the Mages Tower. Like many companions, you can just as easily end up killing her as recruiting her, but she serves a really interesting role in the ensemble if you do bring her along, that of mentor and conscience. As you go about Ferelden, doing your great deeds and slaying your mighty foes, she'll constantly be ego-checking you, reminding you that swinging a sword doesn't amount to shit without compassion somewhere behind it. She can come off as too matronly sometimes, but she isn't. There's a great throwaway conversation, for example, where Alistair asks her to mend his socks, since she's, quote, you know, kind of grandmotherly and grandmothers do that sort of thing, and she puts him down tough. I really like scrappy older characters in games like this, characters who figure they'll keep on living at full speed until the curtain comes down once and for all. I like making my own player characters older for that reason. I find it more compelling to imagine rising up to save the kingdom at the end of one's life when you've already lived and there's nothing left to lose, than to play as someone who doesn't know shit and hasn't yet seen the world. If you got the patience for Wynne, she's one of the most endearing characters in the game. Leliana is a former sister with the Chantry, the monotheistic religious body that dominates the culture of Dragon Age. Before that, she was a bard, both storyteller and spy, deeply entrenched in the bloody politicking of Orlais, the neighboring kingdom with a kind of French aesthetic flavor to it. Leliana could have been a bit of a flat note as a companion, she's so classically feminine and warm, but BioWare presents her in a more nuanced way than you'd expect. For the bulk of the game, you can never quite tell if her sweetness is genuine or if you're being played. She is, after all, a master manipulator by her own admission. She's complex and well-defined, and we'll talk more about her when we talk about her very own piece of DLC, Leliana's Song. Then there's the gray area characters, where you're not quite sure where they'll land on moral topics. This would include Sten, Shale, the companion added by the Stone Prisoner DLC, and Oghren. Sten is one of the best fantasy characters of the past few years. Here's an emblematic reason why. When you first get a chance to ask him personal questions in the party camp, like you do, he refuses to answer. Flat out. Sten, buddy, tell me about yourself, you'll say, conditioned by these games to expect a lengthy response, and Sten says no. He's a genuinely foreign person, a member of a unique to Dragon Age race called the Qunari, who follow an unyieldingly rigid doctrine called the Qun. Sten is Sten's name, but it's also his title and function in his society. Does that sound familiar? Sten and the Grey Warden are the same that way, and what Sten respects the most from the player are decisions that are true to your duty, with no compassion or distraction. He comes across so severely at first, because he doesn't know if he'll live up to the expectations of your station, as he worries that he's failed in the expectations of his. But then he warms up to you. And the first time he confesses his secret love of cookies, you'll shit yourself laughing. Another character who can't escape the nature of their duty is Shale, who not many people got a chance to experience on account of Shale being bonus content. That's bullshit, because Shale is an amazing character, deeply connected with the events of the game, and should have flatly been part of the main game. Now that there's the Ultimate Edition, with everything that there is as a bundle, this is less of a problem, but Shale highlights the way DLC as a business model can severely disrupt the fullness of a game experience. In any case, Shale is a golem, a dwarven construct powered by the soul of a real dwarf. You'd expect some kind of stoic, serious character to go along with that kind of background. You'd be wrong. Shale is bitter, sardonic, and consistently one of the most laugh-out-loud hilarious characters in the game. The way Shale both embraces being a destructive war machine and holds great resentment towards it is really fascinating. Shale's personal subplot is consistently supported throughout the whole campaign as well. She dramatically expands her conversation with the lost paragon Caridon when you get to him, and she opens up a whole new Taig to discover, Kadash Taig, her home when she was still a dwarf. Then there's Oghren. Not a lot of people know what to make of Oghren, not because he's a complicated character, but because he's a drunk, sexist jackass who can't quite live up to the comedic expectations that the game places on him. I mean, you can see what they meant Oghren to be, a flatulent foil for the much more serious concerns you're facing and the deep personal troubles affecting other companions, but Oghren is one toke over the line every time. I work with a guy just like Oghren. He even looks like him a little bit. And I'll tell you, it doesn't matter whether you're making pizza or saving the kingdom with someone like that, eventually you're going to want to shout, "Shut the fuck up, just fucking zip it!" But you know they can't, and you know they won't, and so you avoid them. Such is Oghren. Occasionally he'll have a decent cheap joke, I'll admit, but the vast majority of his humor is just basic jackassery, and I can get enough of that working food service. We'll finish up with the amoral characters, which would include Loghain, Zevran, and Morrigan. Loghain we've pretty much covered, and he's interesting if you admire Machiavellian politicking, but he's mostly just a ham. Zevran, on the other hand, is one of the most charismatic characters of the bunch. Like the Grey Warden, he is bound to his role, in Zevran's case being raised from birth to be an assassin by the Antivan Crows. You do your job for the Crows, or they kill you. I believe the way Zevran himself puts it is that it's a gilded cage, but still a cage. Zevran's remarkable as a character, embracing the fact that his life is essentially out of his own control, and determined to keep in good spirits about it. For a murderer, he's a real pal. Zevran's also bisexual, and will flirt with whatever gender of Grey Warden you happen to have. It's handled in a great way. Other games might make a big deal about his sexuality, but Dragon Age takes a very casual angle, just like, no big deal, checking to see if you're into that sort of thing. If you're not, Zevran shrugs and the game continues normally. If you are, well, here is your big opportunity in the narrative to add that element. Being gay isn't a big deal, and to have a game maturely agree and not treat it like a big deal is awesome, especially considering that Zevran is a great character anyway. Then there's Morrigan. Morrigan is by far one of the most strongly defined women in gaming. Her personality makes sense considering her background. She never compromises her motives and character just because the player asks, and she's deeply integrated with a world-altering plot twist. Now, Dragon Age doesn't assign the player a morality score, like Mass Effect's Paragon Renegade system. It just has the characters you travel with react to your decisions, expressed through a numerical personal approval system. So do something or say something companion agrees with or disagrees with, and that gets scored based on these approval points. Morrigan is fascinating in the kind of things that she values, and as one of the first companions you take along, she introduces the player really well to the kind of thoughtful role-playing you'll have to do to try to satisfy everyone in your party. And really, you can't satisfy everyone. If you do take her along, she'll continually call bullshit on things you, the player, probably consider important. She'll even force a conversation that can lead to Wynn's death in the Mage's Tower if you're not diplomatic about it. Interestingly, Morrigan is also one of the more commonly chosen romantic subplots in the game. Player romances have been part of the BioWare RPG experience since Baldur's Gate 2, and I would contend that they have an important place in the format. There's enough of a distance between the player and their character that it's easy to get into the romance as part of the larger narrative and as a fun additional way of interacting with the plot without feeling like a weirdo for it. Dragon Age's romances are phenomenally integrated with the plot, across all genders and orientations of player character. But Morrigan is special because whether or not you have a relationship with her, she'll try to have your baby by the end of the game. Or Alistair's if you're unwilling or unequipped. Of course, it's only sort of your baby. By conceiving the child on the eve of killing the archdemon, the soul of the ancient dragon will be reincarnated in the child without the taint of the Darkspawn. A soul-laundering racket, basically. It's risky to throw sex into the main plot and still expect people to take it seriously, but Dragon Age pulls it off amazingly well. And the script, amazingly, anyway, because Dragon Age does take one completely idiotic misstep here. It throws in a fully animated PG-13 quality sex scene with your character and your chosen romance, just as they appear in the game, no matter how ridiculous your character looks, set to a swooping orchestral number. It's up there with the top 10 stupidest things I've seen in my entire life. I cannot possibly imagine why BioWare felt like watching 3D puppets pretend to fuck would make my experience more immersive, because it didn't. The romances themselves are well written, often quite touching, but things get real dumb real quick once they decide to show you what Alistair's O-face looks like. As you get to know this cast of characters, they'll not only interact with you, but with each other. In many cases, the incidental dialogue you'll overhear just adventuring around is some of the best in the game. And you'll have plenty to hear because there is an absolute metric fuck-ton of adventuring to do, although very little of it is in the kind of free-form exploration that Skyrim would have allowed you. A thorough playthrough of Dragon Age will only last you about half as long or less as a thorough playthrough of Skyrim. But so much more will happen. Dragon Age is event after event after event, demanding your input every step of the way. Compared to Skyrim, the design of the actual digital game world is laughably simplistic. Dragon Age is a world of corridors and enemies. You have to go down all the corridors and fight all the enemies to win. There's little more to it. Its combat system is generally engaging and works well within the tradition of semi-turn-based, pause-when-you-want-to tactical combat that goes all the way back to Baldur's Gate, but at higher levels, the character builds aren't really very distinct from one another outside their chosen focus, and when it comes time to level up, there's just not a lot of excitement in it. The depth of personal customization that you'd find in a game like Neverwinter Nights, which uses 3rd edition D&D rules, just isn't there. That's okay, though. If the gameplay is simple, it forms only the skeleton on which the flesh of the game, its story and characters, grows so thickly that you can only see the vague outline of bone. Dragon Age Origins is the foundation of an entirely new fantasy mythology, and the 5 plot modules, the Dalish and the Werewolves, the Mage's Circle, Redcliffe, Orzammar, the Ashes of Andraste, and Denerim, as well as 2 more plot modules in DLC, serve not only as the bulk of the game, but a means of establishing a new proprietary universe for BioWare. Perhaps the most unique feature of the universe of Dragon Age, to me at least, is its decision to make its mythology primarily monotheistic. I really want to emphasize what a bold move it is on BioWare's part to draw so heavily from traditional Christian themes. Most fantasy universes, like D&D and the Elder Scrolls, delight in coming up with their own polytheistic pantheons of gods and goddesses, with great success, using the many gods to represent all sorts of themes and outlooks they want to see represented in the setting. Having all these different deities eases the job of writing. Dragon Age has a bit of that too in the polytheistic elven religion, and there's also the fact that most modern geeks, myself included, are irreligious. We're probably going to be more interested in wildly creative invented religion than one thematically tied to Catholicism. So having the Maker, the one human god, and the Chantry, the fantasy version of the Vatican, be so culturally dominant in Dragon Age really is kind of a risk. But it pays off, because it allows the developers to draw on cultural themes that are personally familiar and meaningful to the player, regardless of whether they themselves are religious, and also because the fantasy setting allows the exploration of a Christian-like monotheism in a more relatable, charismatic way than real Christianity, because in Dragon Age, there really are such things as demons. It's also culturally differentiated in its approach to gender. Only women may preach in the Chantry, not men. The way magic operates in Dragon Age, practically and culturally, is fascinating. According to the Chantry, the first thing the Maker created was the Fade, but the Fade is ever-changing and doesn't really know time the way the mortal world does. And the life of the spirits there, according to the Chant of Light, the doctrine of the Chantry, was meaningless and boring to the Maker because of it. True life must have permanent consequence and a finite existence. So then, the mortal realm. Mages draw upon the raw, unpredictable powers of the Fade to change the mortal world, as the Fade may be changed, on whim and according to desire, but they're left vulnerable to the spirits of the Fade during these magics. These spirits can be good or neutral, but those spirits have little interest in the affairs of mortal. Some spirits crave what mortals have, and they'll exploit the shit out of mortals to draw them into the Fade and take their place in the mortal world. These are the demons, and in Dragon Age, they're categorized by the ways that they tempt mortals away from their earthly life, and those temptations just happen to be extraordinarily similar to the 7 deadly sins. Demons in Dragon Age are really genuinely amazing from a speculative fantasy standpoint. A lot of them have very compelling arguments for how the relationship they have with mortal souls is more symbiotic than parasitic, and they'll argue the case persuasively and winningly. If they can't talk you into letting them be, they'll fight, and fight viciously. Since mages are particularly vulnerable, the Chantry demands that they be strictly regulated and controlled from the very moment a child shows signs of being magically receptive. The Templars are the order that oversees the mages, and since any unregulated mage could at any moment switch out for a powerful demon from beyond the veil of reality, they take a dim view of runners. They call them apostates, and they kill them. The narrative of Dragon Age is superb in that it shows snippets of life and life philosophies from every angle of this central dialectic. Many Templars care for the mages, truly, but are bound by duty to a life of persecuting them, and some hate and fear the mages for what they represent. Many mages see the need for the Templars and are grateful for them, but many mages hate them for their draconian control over the entire life of a mage. All characters operate as individuals within this essentially insoluble conflict. For every character that acts predictably, there is one who will surprise you. That's one of the game's absolutely central themes, that it is up to the individual to interpret the ethical demands of their station in life.
Of course she's a cat. She just talks, that's all.
Talking is simple enough, once you know how.
Then there's the non-human races, like the elves, who we've talked about, and the Qunari, who we'll talk about more when we talk about Dragon Age 2. And then there's the dwarves. Both the dwarves and the elves adhere mostly to the cliches of traditional fantasy, but both are given interesting twists by the setting. The dwarves, for example, are living in the absolute twilight of their civilization. Before the Darkspawn, the dwarven Taigs connected most of the world in a labyrinth of gleaming tunnels called the Deep Roads. When the Darkspawn came into the world, they tried to destroy the surface world in the first Blight, but then they went underground, where they stayed and became Legion. The Darkspawn completely destroyed the dwarven civilization, except for a few disconnected holdouts that persevere. They're a strong, pragmatic culture, driven to petty infighting by being penned in a corner by the Darkspawn for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. It's remarkable how impressive and heartbreaking the lost civilization of the dwarves is in Dragon Age. I'm a sucker for lost civilizations, to be sure, but Dragon Age paints a particularly vivid and interesting portrait of an empire after its fall. Similarly, the elves are also a culture that have lost their empire and their heritage. The Tevinter Imperium, the same ones who would trigger the creation of the Darkspawn, defeated and enslaved the elves many years ago. Since then, as the power of the Imperium waned, they've divided into the nomadic Dalish tribes, who, lacking a homeland and unwanted wherever they go, wander the forests endlessly, trying to keep burning what embers of their rich and ancient culture remain, and the city elves, who live in slums called alienages, trapped in a permanent underclass in human cities. In the construction of the world of Dragon Age, the fall of these great cultures created a vacuum that humanity has moved into rapidly. In terms of the whole history of Dragon Age, human dominance and the authority of the Chantry is relatively new. Historical events have created cultural dialectics that you see presented in the game. I can't even begin to express what thorough, excellent world-building this is, and indeed Origins lives up to its name by being the foundation of not just games, but novels and comics set in the rich lore this game establishes. You can spend hours and hours perusing the extra background lore available in the game's codex, much more conveniently accessible than reading books in the Skyrim. So, all of these different adventure modules you go through, spooling up to the conclusion, establish different themes and fleshes out the definition of the world of Dragon Age, but they create a small problem with the pacing. Many people I talk to experience real slump and enjoyment around the 30-hour mark of Dragon Age, when they're headed to Orzammar, usually. The thing is, having these different parts of the plot so separated allows them to be played in a more free-form order, and their internal tidiness allows them to bundle the consequences of your decisions and let them play out much later in the climax, so as not to overly interfere with other parts of the modular plot. Instead of simplifying and unifying the quests, as Skyrim did, Dragon Age compartmentalizes them. But by the time you get to your last module, you're feeling a little fatigue in starting a whole new set of concerns and learning a whole new aspect of the game's culture after being separated from the events at Ostagar for many, many hours. That's understandable. If you've played the game and experienced this, let me recommend just letting the game lay low for a week or two. You'll keep thinking about it, and after a while it'll feel fresher and you'll have enough patience to keep through to the end, which pays off tremendously. The biggest challenge to a traditional RPG, even one as well executed as Dragon Age, is reconciling player choice with how rich a response to player choice they can afford to put in the game. Every twist in the story that they return to has to account for 2 or more branches, and then those branches might interact with each other as well. It becomes extremely complicated, extremely quickly. In older RPGs, you see a lot more plot reactivity to player choice, and a lot of that is because, with non-voiced characters being the norm and limited, relatively cheap to produce compared to today graphics, meant that they could flat out afford the man-hours to program more responses to more player choices. Think about Baldur's Gate, its sprites and its text, and the game pauses when you're in a conversation. Now think about Dragon Age. In conversation, you need to pay voice actors, determine camera angles, lip-sync the characters, and that's on top of all the writing and editing work you've had to do for a game like Baldur's Gate. If there is a reduced complexity in RPG design today, it is hand in hand with a dramatic increase in the complexity of its presentation. Dragon Age is a fundamentally simple game, with peerless, vivid presentation. That Origins stays so loyal to the complex format of old BioWare games while still pulling out all the stops of its modern cinematic RPG peers floors me. This game is a triumph, and it's that way because a lot of people put a lot of passion and a lot of sweat into making it so. DLC also adds 2 short, albeit very memorable, extra modules to your experience as the Grey Warden. The first, Warden's Keep, acts as a kind of prologue to the expansion pack, Dragon Age Awakening. It has you making your way to a long-forgotten Grey Warden outpost, which was, years ago, host to a failed political coup on behalf of the Wardens. Now, the Wardens are supposed to be apolitical, dedicated only to fight the Darkspawn, and for the very reasons presented in this DLC. The Wardens rose up back then against the injustices of a tyrant, something you, the player, have some familiarity with. But the Keep was overwhelmed, and in desperation the Warden commander demanded the use of blood magic. To sacrifice mortal flesh and bind it to magic is a powerful and forbidden thing in Dragon Age, because more so than any other magic, it invites the attention of demons. Those demons overwhelmed the Keep, and for decades the mage who released them has conducted hideous and cruel experiments in blood magic to stem the tide of genuine demonic invasion, until you arrive to upset the careful balance of evil within the fortress, that is. It's good content, but not great content. The combat is too lengthy, and it's very uninspired, but the questions it raises about the nature of your duty as a Grey Warden are very compelling. It's worth doing. More worth doing is the other DLC, Return to Ostagar. It's very, very short, but it's a little piece of storytelling that really ought to have been included in the main game. You're asked to retrieve some of the slain King Kaelin's belongings from Ostagar, where you're journeying to with Duncan in the introduction, where the Fifth Blight began. When you get there, the seasons have turned. It's winter now. Snow covers the blood-soaked ground. Dragon Age is a game driven mostly by words. Return to Ostagar is one of the few moments it's truly successful at making the player emotionally connected to the environment through visual storytelling. This wintry nostalgia trip is incredibly effective at making the player feel like their warden has grown and changed, become a different person than the fresh-faced recruit from the game's early hours. The whole hour or two of the DLC has a quiet melancholy to it that really satisfies. It's an important part of the Origins experience. So it's problematic that it's hidden in this obscure piece of DLC that so few people have played. The last part of the game sees the Darkspawn flooding into Denerim, with your ragtag army hot on their heels in pursuit from Redcliffe. A speech is made, the army is rallied, and you're given a chance to say goodbye individually to each of your companions before the final confrontation, and then divide up action teams to either stay with you or defend the gates. The climax itself is pretty linear, but it changes subtly depending on what sorts of decisions you've made in the game. The combat also kicks into a different gear, pitching you against dozens and dozens of very weak Darkspawn, peppered with more formidable ones, upping the pace of the action by a huge margin, and making you feel like you really are wading through a sea of foul and disgusting creatures. It's well played, and the pacing is lightning fast, constantly switching from action to cutscene and giving a serious feeling of epic finality. There's been some criticism leveled at Origins for being too simple this way, that there's a single, unilaterally evil and dangerous enemy which you raise an army to destroy, and then you destroy it, and that's it. It's true, so it is simple, but that simplicity in the basic plot arc is totally immaterial to what Origins is trying to accomplish, which is to establish this entirely new mythology and tell a thrilling tale of high adventure while doing it. At this, it succeeds beyond all expectation. I can't and won't fault the plot for being simple when its narrative focus is on so many other things. You knew you were going to come to this confrontation and slay the archdemon since hour 1 of the game, and that detracts not one bit from the satisfaction of the moment. The epilogue is where your choices are most strongly collated, and in some appropriately old-school ways. In keeping with the tradition of fantasy classics, you get to make one request of the king or queen in reward for your valiant efforts storming the castle. On previous playthroughs, I asked for titles or for spoils, but on this playthrough I was offered something new. I could request that the Dalish Elves be granted land, at long last. That's such a huge moment for the Dalish, and the Grey Warden, as a member of the Dalish, would be their highest-profile champion in hundreds of years. Suddenly, my experiences in the very first hour of the game are brought around again and given closure here in the 50th hour. Well played, Dragon Age. Well played. You'll get to talk to many of your companions about their future plans after the events of Origins, and it feels so good to end the game here, in this moment of speculative conversation, as opposed to cutting it off at the Archdemon's death. It makes the game feel more full, the ending more final. And one of Origins' most old-school touches yet, it gives you ending slides, expanding in pretty good detail about the ramifications of the decisions you've been making throughout your entire experience of play. But all this is only about 2/3 of the full Origins experience. The Grey Warden gets 3 more adventures, one of which is a whole new campaign, and you also get a flashback DLC where you play as Leliana, and what I can only describe as a joke DLC called the Darkspawn Chronicles. Dragon Age is one of the games that helped entrench DLC as a viable profit model, but it's also home to one of the most genuinely epic expansion packs of the past few years. Awakening is one of those rare pieces of secondary content that actually surpasses the primary campaign in terms of visual design, sense of immediacy, and pacing. It has all the things that make the Dragon Age experience so fantastic, but in different ratios that make it feel a little more unpredictable and engaging. Awakening is about a third as long as the Origins campaign, around 15 hours or so, but its content is packed in unbelievably tight. Even at such a short length, it's still got an introduction, 3 sub-adventures, which are really too small to be called modules, a city sequence like Origins' freeform Denerim quest, and a climactic sequence dealing with a pitched Arling-wide confrontation and epic consequences. It's even got new companions for you to get to know. Literally every single thing worthwhile about Origins is in here, but on a tighter schedule. I haven't enjoyed an expansion pack this much since Mask of the Betrayer came out for Neverwinter Nights 2, and really, you'd have to go back to Neverwinter Nights or Throne of Ball for Baldur's Gate 2 to find another expansion pack that, well, expands so well. Now that the job of establishing the world of Dragon Age has been accomplished through the main campaign, Awakening is free to start putting twists on it, twists that would not have worked without spending so much time and energy establishing a baseline for what's normal and what isn't in its constructed universe. It also has a major stronghold building element, heavily reminiscent of Neverwinter Nights 2's main campaign, and a refocusing of level design to make these huge outdoor areas filled with dozens of minor quests and secrets, also a common design in older RPGs but absent from Origins. If Dragon Age Origins was old school in its intent, Awakening finally fulfills the promise and is truly old school in its execution as well. Plus, the statistics and combat systems finally start to feel compelling. In Origins, it sometimes felt like leveling up was just playing the waiting game until you got all the abilities in your bracket, and you wouldn't get that way until the very final portions of the game. Origins was fun, but combat didn't feel truly dynamic until you'd already invested a lot of time in the game. Here, your adventures in the small Arling of Amaranthine begin at the peak of your abilities, and you get stronger from there. The game's combat encounters are more varied and dangerous to test your high-level abilities, and both these things in combination make Awakening feel so much more rewarding in the basic playing of it than Origins. Origins' 2 primary focuses in its script writing were world building and companion interaction. Awakening is too short to do either of those things with the complexity that Origins did, so its focus is more on actual adventuring and dense plotting. At these, it's a wild success. So, after the events of Origins, the king or queen grant the Grey Warden the Arling of Amaranthine, the former lands of Earl Rendon Howe, who you killed quite thoroughly back during the final days of the Blight. When you arrive at the seat of power, the ancient fortress of Vigil's Keep, you'll find that it is under attack by Darkspawn, even after the end of the Blight, which is pretty unusual. Not as unusual as the Darkspawn that leads them, however. He speaks, not as a demon, but as a creature of free will. That's a pretty goddamn big problem. After cleaning out the keep, you're given a few threads to follow for leads on where these Darkspawn may be coming from and how or why some of them may be transcending their base and unthinking natures. These threads usually come with a new companion on top of whatever questing concerns there may be, and on account of that, there may end up being companions who you don't spend that much time with. Awakening makes it easy on you, though. Getting to know your companions and earning approval points through conversation and gifts happens very swiftly, and it's reasonable to expect that you'll feel connected to even your late arrivals. At the beginning, you'll get a small handful of companions to start you off. For reasons beyond my understanding, Oghren is the only returning companion from Origins to actually be in your party. He's a lot easier to deal with in Awakening, though. He's actually a bit better written. Instead of being pure comic relief, he's got a bit of an edge. He likes to drink, he likes to kill, and beyond that, he doesn't give many shits. No shits whatsoever given towards caring how you feel about that. This extra confidence makes the character work. The writers know that you don't like Oghren, so instead of having him make a fart joke to break the tension, Oghren's just very upfront about what he is and what he isn't, and I liked that. You'll also get Anders, an apostate who you can shelter from the Chantry by inducting him to the Grey Wardens. If you've played Dragon Age 2, but not Awakening, it's going to be weird seeing Anders here. He's actually very likable, and he's written in a very quick-witted, warm way, and has much more balanced attitude towards mages in the Chantry. So much of Awakening is action and high stakes and other exclamation points activities, and Anders is great at providing a baseline of quiet, reasonable, personable response to all the crazy shit that goes down over the course of the expansion. Plus, you can give him the gift of a kitten, whom he names Sir Pouncelot and carries the rest of the game. The companion Sigrun comes to you during the Kal Hirol portions of the game, in which the Warden Commander delves deep into one of the very first Dwarven Taigs to fall to the Darkspawn, back during the First Blight. Kal Hirol is superb, the most interesting Taig yet portrayed in Dragon Age. Back during the height of the Dwarven civilization, Kal Hirol was one of its richest and grandest Taigs. When it was evacuated, 500 casteless, the permanent underclass of dwarf society who aren't permitted to hold jobs or own real estate, were left behind. In a series of ghostly flashbacks, Kal Hirol tells the story of 200 of the 500 who let go of the resentments they had towards what had been, to them, a glittering prison their whole lives, and stood to face the advance of the limitless Darkspawn horde. It's well portrayed, and it's solid fantasy writing. They're throwing together class politics, mythological storytelling, and the player's natural drive to dungeon dive to create an extremely immersive adventure. It's here you'll pick up Sigrun, a member of the Dwarven Legion of the Dead. The Legion is a really neat part of Dragon Age lore. It goes that since the struggle against the Darkspawn is eternal for the dwarves, anyone, regardless of caste or crime, can have themselves a nice little pre-funeral and dedicate themselves permanently to the Legion, where they will be honored and remembered for their sacrifice. The catch being, of course, that it's Darkspawn, Darkspawn, Darkspawn until the minute you die. Sigrun, like Zevran, doesn't seem troubled by the fact that she has so little control over her destiny and that she spends every moment so close to death. Sigrun's a phenomenal character, very charismatic, and she'll round out your understanding of a dwarven culture much better than Oghren ever did. The Wending Wood portion has you recruiting the problem you went there to solve in the first place. Valana is a Dalish elf whose tribe was murdered, presumably by local humans, and she is out for bloody vengeance. Valana is a radical, uncompromising and somewhat unhinged, fanatical in both her hatred of humans and her commitment to her Dalish heritage. The humans are not responsible, though. The Darkspawn are. The Darkspawn framed the humans to drive Valana to this point, which underlines just what a worldwide disaster intelligent Darkspawn would be. That is too clever by half. This means that the creatures have her sister, and when you finally reach her, it's clear that something is seriously amiss. Valana's sister won't leave the Darkspawn. She's loyal now to a truly twisted and strange-looking Darkspawn called the Architect, one of the few ever to come into the world without the calling of the Taint overwhelming their identity. The Architect finds the Wardens, as a middle ground between living things and whatever it is that the Darkspawn really are, fascinating, and concocted a ritual like the Joining that will sever the Darkspawn's connection with the voice that compels and guides them. The Architect is an amazing character, an antagonist who isn't an antagonist. They wrote the Architect in such a way that his foreignness, his disconnection, his lack of understanding of what conventional life finds meaningful, and his soft and melancholy voice work all come together to paint a tremendously interesting portrait of a monster caught between worlds, truly alone in many ways. It's the Frankenstein aesthetic. Monsters are monstrous, but it's the world's rejection of them that makes them truly dangerous. The Architect feels like too complex of a character to appear from out of nowhere, and he doesn't. He's actually from a Dragon Age novel called The Calling. Proprietary novels are a major tradition in fantasy writing. There is no way that D&D's Forgotten Realms, the world of Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, and Neverwinter Nights, would be so complex and ubiquitous without all the work of fantasy legend R.A. Salvatore and the many, many excellent novels he wrote in the setting, him and other authors. Origin spends so much time developing the setting exactly so that they could do the same thing, use the game as a launching pad for a multimedia fantasy fiefdom owned by BioWare. You shouldn't discount the books just because they're trademarked. As is so often the case in American media, creativity can only flourish if business circumstance allows it. The most memorable portion of the game is the Black Marsh, and the events that happen there will have ramifications that run deep throughout Dragon Age 2, and likely well beyond. Black Marsh hits all the right notes to make a Dragon Age experience really sing. It has superb traditional level design, an amazing blend of fairy tale tropes and contemporary role-playing, and remarkable, surprising character interaction. The Black Marsh is a giant area, where the people of the Great Swamp's town have been trapped in the Fade for hundreds of years by a shadowy figure called the Baroness. You're there because a fellow Grey Warden, Kristoff, went missing in the area. It's an ambush, and after a confrontation with a Darkspawn called the First, he casts a spell taught to him by the expansion's real villain, the Mother. It sends you both into the Fade, where you'll meet one of the few good spirits of the Fade, an embodiment of Justice named, well, Justice. It's what he is. When you find a way to gain release from the Fade, not only you, but also the Baroness and Justice come back to the mortal realm, Justice finding himself animating the slowly rotting body of the slain Warden Kristoff. Justice is one of the expansion's best accomplishments. He gives insight into the experience of being a creature of the Fade, sheds new perspective on the tasks at hand, and is absolutely steadfast in his personality. He is Justice. He does not try to be more, cannot be less. After the events of the game, Anders allows Justice to merge with him in his body so that Justice doesn't have to stay trapped in Kristoff's crumbling form due to the friendship that they both share. Anders does this out of compassion and out of friendship. If you take into account all that happens here, who Anders is before the merge, who Justice is before the merge, the end events of Dragon Age 2 feel much more substantial and reasonable. It's a little frustrating that so much important background is here in content that comparatively few have played, certainly fewer than have played Dragon Age 2, but that's the way of it. Awakening is hugely critical to the lore development of the series as a whole, and it does not get enough credit for that. Your last companion is Nathaniel Howe, son of Rendon. When you first encounter him early in the game, he's bitter, hateful, and broken, but over the course of the expansion you can coax him into embracing a personal heroism in spite of the sins of his family. Howe's not great, but he's well done and well acted, a solid, predictable addition to the cast. Similarly, the city of Amaranthine and the quest sealing the deep road tunnels beneath Vigil's Keep are well executed, but not especially memorable. What's great is that it really does have this frontier feeling of being away from the center of power in Denerim, relatively on your own in this backwater place. After defeating the Archdemon and ending the Fifth Blight, it's perfectly right. You save the world and then ask, what now? And Awakening has written that sensation of being fundamentally at loose ends very subtly and thoroughly into many aspects of the script. The experience of governing your Arling, assigning troops, and dealing with the complaints of both peasants and nobles is absolutely saturated with the message that being a hero is only the beginning of your obligations and not the end. If you played Warden's Keep and experienced the story of Soldier's Peak back in the main campaign, you get an extra sense of how political power is somehow fundamentally incompatible with the mission of the Wardens, and you're forced to reconcile that within your character. Eventually, you'll be called on to either save the city of Amaranthine or Vigil's Keep. Do you trust the defenses of the Keep? Is it too late to save the city? Is the Architect holding all the cards in this situation? It's a great climax, satisfying and deeply tied to the minute choices that you've been making throughout the entire expansion. The last confrontation of Awakening is with the Mother. You see, the Architect's ritual of freeing his fellow Darkspawn from the Calling isn't universally workable. When he freed a Broodmother, the Mother, from the Voice, and she was forced to confront the thing that she had become, it drove her mad. She would do anything to get the Voices back, and the Architect would pay for his unwanted gift of self-knowledge. She also reveals a piece of information that the Architect had hidden from you, that he was responsible for the Fifth Blight when he tried to perform his version of the joining ritual on one of the ancient sleeping dragons who carry the taint. It didn't take too kindly to it, and that's the Archdemon you kill at the end of Origins. You have the opportunity to kill the Architect as well if you want, but for me, I was too damn curious to see what they do with him in future games to have his place in the world end right there. So, then, the fight with the Mother. The Broodmother was one of the most horrific and disgusting of all the Darkspawn when you encountered one in Origins, particularly since you find out how they come into being. Living women are tainted and forced to eat their friends and loved ones, growing larger and more twisted almost exponentially until they are monsters themselves. It's really uncomfortable horror, the idea of having your body taken from your control and twisted into something you hate, the kind of horror on which this human centipede made its box office income. The visual design of the Mother as a genuine monster taps into that discomfort unbelievably well, throwing sexual elements on top of this heaving mass of abominable flesh. It's almost a Clive Barker monster, the way it blends sexuality and horror. The Mother is an awful thing to behold, definitely the weirdest, most memorable creature in Dragon Age, any Dragon Age. From a gameplay perspective, it's a great fight, too. All in all, I'd call Awakening pretty much a perfect expansion pack in a lot of ways. It's the fact that it not only sustains the player's fascination to the very last minute, but also fires on all cylinders in terms of gameplay, writing, and visual design on top of it that takes it to that level of perfection. It's got epilogue slides as well, but as immense a journey as Awakening is, it is not the end of your experience as the Grey Warden. Next up for the Warden is a short, dense little piece of DLC called the Golems of Amgarak. This is by far the most traditional part of the entirety of Dragon Age. It is a straight-up, one-dungeon adventure module, like you might buy in a little pamphlet for you and your friends all the way back to in the pen-and-paper days before computer role-playing was even a thing. You get 2 maps, Amgarak and the approach to Amgarak, but you've still got a solid couple of hours of content packed into it. Amgarak is a puzzle box, solvable with a little cleverness, a keen understanding of the game's tactical combat system, and a nose for searching every corner of a map for treasure and clues. This is the difficult, thoughtful, comprehensive dungeon crawl experience that D&D-style role-playing fans have been itching for, broken off into DLC so that more casual players wouldn't feel required to do it if they didn't want to. It's very competent at what it does, too, and even if the adventure is short, it'll stay with you. If not for the incredibly solid traditional design, then for the Harvester, the boss of Golems of Amgarak. The Harvester is such a disgusting, weird creature, and the boss fight is so good that they'd flat out reuse it during the climax of Dragon Age 2, when First Enchanter Orsino turns himself into one with the corpses of his slain fellow mages and a healthy dose of blood magic. The Grey Warden's adventures finally come to a close of sorts in Witch Hunt, the last piece of DLC ever released for Dragon Age Origins. It's a little hard to know what to say about Witch Hunt, because on one hand it's a bad product, dull and frustrating in its technical construction, but on the other hand it's actually an amazing and fitting conclusion to the whole close to 80-hour experience of being the Grey Warden. The fundamental problem with Witch Hunt is that there's really not very much that needs to happen in the script for it, probably around a half an hour or so of really meaningful stuff, and then they try to stretch that to a little over 2 hours so you feel better about having paid $10 for it. At the conclusion of Origins, Morgan leaves, either with a Grey Warden's child or without, demanding that no attempt be made to follow, even or perhaps especially if your character has a romance with her. Witch Hunt takes place years after Origins and Awakening, and a thick dust covers Flemeth's hut down in Kokari Wilds, long abandoned. Here's where you begin your last quest as the Warden. You're looking for Morrigan. In the hut, an elf named Ariane is looking for a missing elven tome that holds some secrets of the lost elven civilization. Your quest is very, very simple and totally straightforward from there. You go to the Mage's Tower to investigate the book, learn the clues, follow the clues, find Morrigan. It seems that what Morrigan's been after is the secrets of the Eluvions. Like the mirror that poisoned you with the taint in the first place, all those long hours ago if you're playing a Dalish Warden like I was. To find the whole mirror Morrigan is tracking, you need to return to the ancient temple in the deep woods where it all began and take a piece of the shattered Eluvion. On the one hand, if that's not your origin, then this sequence will just fall into a larger problem with Witch Hunt, where every single one of the environments is recycled. You're retreading maps you've already played before for the entirety of the DLC. And after close to 80 hours, that's not cool to do to players. On the other hand, if it is your origin, you might be surprised how meaningful this return to the beginning is. The mirror, and your life, shattered at once, so many years ago now, when you and Tamlin first went hunting in the woods. Now look at your Warden. Save all of Ferelden from the archdemons, save all of Amaranthine from the Mother, discover the secrets of one of the most dangerous lost tigers of the dwarves. But what now? Who are you when there are no more kingdoms to save? Finding Morrigan isn't just about finding answers and knowing what became of that mystical baby of hers. It's about a hero who's running out of frontiers. It's not a theme they slap you in the face with, but it's there, and it's fascinating. When Witch Hunt came out, people were irritated that it raised more questions than it answered, but that was quite deliberate on BioWare's part. It's foreshadowing an upcoming Dragon Age. What's unexpected is that Witch Hunt wasn't foreshadowing Dragon Age 2. It's building towards plot twists and world events that it's looking increasingly likely will play out over the course of Dragon Age 3, Inquisition, due out towards the end of this year. When you reach the Eluvion, hidden in the chamber that you killed the Mother in back in Awakening, Morrigan has activated it, and it glows with a sickly purple hue. It's not just going to take her to the Fade, it will take her beyond the Fade, into parts of existence not yet known to the world or to the player, and the trip is one way, the mere single use. This conversation will have dramatically different outcomes depending on what happened between you and Morrigan in the original campaign of Origins, and if you want to continue treating Morrigan the way you have been. Morrigan, on her part, is consumed with a sense of duty. What kind of duty is unclear, but she's a woman with a purpose, and that purpose doesn't include the Warden, even if it does include the Warden's very own child. Morrigan warns you that the real danger to the world is Flemeth, that Flemeth is neither mortal nor demon, and she is certainly not dead. And then comes the choice. Morrigan will leave through the portal, and you can try to stop her or let her be, or if she cares enough for you, you can come along. During the campaign, I played through the Morrigan romance arc, and she gives you at one point a ring that will always let her know where you are. I kept it, and when I finally came to this last bit of Origins, Morrigan not only commented on the ring, but it shifted the course of the whole conversation slightly. It's great writing, and handled very fluidly to be so reactive to minute player choice. When the time came to choose, the Grey Warden I had been steering along for literal months of my life got to reconnect with the mother of his child, and then step through a portal to another dimension altogether, driven by duty, defined by choice. I'd finished playing Origins before, but this was my first time playing the game in its absolute totality, and I was blown away by how much more personally meaningful the experience of the game was with all of this extra content, and to end the game here, in this moment of absolute transition, felt so satisfying. Much earlier, I said that if I had to describe Dragon Age Origins in one sentence, it would be, Origins is the best choose-your-own-adventure novel ever written. I would have said that before, having played mostly just the core game, but after really experiencing the breadth of how massive a story this is, and how mind-bogglingly complex the arrangement of these hinged moments is, I can say it with absolute conviction. Another Dragon Age game may never recapture the more traditional design aspects of Origins, but they may not need to. Origins stands alone, a testament to the strength of its chosen format. Before we talk about Dragon Age 2, I'm going to briefly cover the last two pieces of DLC for the game, Leliana's Song and the Darkspawn Chronicles. In scripting this video, Leliana's Song was a bit of a head-scratcher for me. It's a 2 to 3 hour flashback to the past that Leliana only alludes to in Origins, when she was an Orlesian bard working for a woman named Marjolaine. Why single Leliana out for the honor of having her own personal DLC? How to put that experience in context to the whole of Dragon Age Origins? I didn't really get it, not until I played Dragon Age 2, anyway. Towards the end of Dragon Age 2, when the conflict between the Templars and the Mages reaches its fever pitch, if you have the Exiled Prince DLC, you get a quest called Faith. In it, you'll be asked to meet with a very powerful representative of the Chantry who has come to Kirkwall to determine if the Chantry needs to politically or militarily intervene. That representative is Leliana. Then, at the very end of Dragon Age 2, it's revealed that she was accompanying the woman interrogating Varric for the entire course of his retelling the life of the champion. Leliana's development as a character isn't just critical to enjoying Origins. All indications show she's going to be a major power player in the upcoming third game. She's important to the series, and to see where she came from, how she changed, is it important to a player's long-term investment in Dragon Age, across multiple games, and with multiple sorts of characters. At the beginning of Leliana's Song, she is one mean lady. Leliana steals, murders, and humiliates her way through Denorum's market district in the DLC's opening hour, and then gets pulled by her boss and lover, Marjolaine, into a matter of national treason. Leliana happens upon proof of the treason and mentions it to Marjolaine out of concern. Marjolaine isn't having any of that, though, so she frames Leliana for the whole thing. Leliana is imprisoned, abused, and close to death when she escapes and finds herself being nursed back to health in a chantry. She confronts her captor and Marjolaine on a windswept cliff, and comes there to a personal crossroads. Marjolaine tells Leliana that they are the same, cruel and selfish, fundamentally, and nothing will change that about her. The scene's pretty well done. For a DLC that, in many ways, is pretty deliberately over the top and excessively styled, this last moment is pitch perfect. If you've ever had the mirror held up to you by someone who's hurt you, you can relate, and there's a real sense of loss and personal confusion in the voice work. So, in seeing how fragile and hollow the life she'd built is, Leliana turns to the Chantry. In time, she'll claim that the Maker himself spoke to her and insisted that she help the Grey Warden in the campaign of Origins. Does Leliana talk to the Maker? Again, since this is a fantasy world, Dragon Age can resolve these questions much more satisfactorily than an actual world religion can. Here in Dragon Age, for example, Andraste, the Maker's chosen, was real, her ashes were real, their miraculous healing powers were real. There are an awful lot of coincidences regarding the success of the Warden. Leliana's personal, private relationship with the Maker isn't really okay in the popular dogma of the Chantry. She's a bit of a Protestant to their Catholicism, and I think it is so interesting to have these kinds of religious themes explored in such a wild, free-form way. I've seen pantheon after pantheon of clever invented gods in fantasy settings like this, but while characters like Leliana and many aspects of the Chant of Light pull out of the same strings as polytheistic fantasy religions do, those pantheons never felt as truly culturally relevant as Dragon Age's approach. I was raised Lutheran, so when Leliana talks about how the Maker speaks to her and what that means to her, I get it, I feel it, more than I feel it if a character in, like, Skyrim were to tell me of their love for Talos. To familiarize the player with Leliana's background in this DLC really makes her religious conversion and what the chant means to her feel more real. The repentant sinner is a major familiar trope, but Leliana is complex enough and charismatic enough to pull it off. We'll be seeing more of her in later games, and when we see her there, the writers would like you to keep in mind these parts of Leliana's personality, the cruel parts, the weak parts, and her turning away from that side of herself. All this choice, all this heroism, all this content, you've had your fill. It was a great ride, but fuck it, enough of Origins. This is the time for the quick hour or two that you'll get from the Darkspawn Chronicles, a little what-if package where your Grey Warden is never recruited, and it's up to Alistair alone to save the kingdom. From you. It's a revamp of the Siege of Denerim, where instead of retaking the city with your army from Redcliffe, you help lead the first waves of Darkspawn into the city to burn it down and save the Archdemon from Alistair. There's no voice work, but you'll have a chance to slaughter the vast majority of your adventuring companions and rampage through what you spend so much time trying to save. Not many people bother playing the Darkspawn Chronicles, understandably so since it's not much of a much, but it is a fascinating footnote to the experience. As you kill your companions, you'll get codex entries about how they tried to stop the Blight without your warden, and to see the catastrophic ways the events of Origins might have played out if you hadn't been there to help underlines the weight of the experience. Not much, but enough to notice and stay with you for a while. The Darkspawn might be one of the simplest, most straightforward enemies in modern gaming, but they sure were a perfect way to draw the player into a whole new fantasy franchise. The Darkspawn don't even really need to be the antagonistic focus of upcoming games. They certainly weren't for Dragon Age 2. Where Dragon Age Origins is a fantastic example of a traditionally constructed game, Dragon Age 2 is highly experimental. It's cinematic, it's influenced by television, it's much more action-packed, but it's not that great of a game altogether. It's remarkably inconsistent, and where it experiments, it fails more often than it succeeds. The script is still fantastic, however, in a lot of places, and it's worth taking a look at. If Skyrim is an open-world fantasy simulator and Origins is a modern take on traditional Dungeons & Dragons role-playing, it's much harder to find a neat category for Dragon Age 2. Dragon Age 2 is probably the most experimental big-budget RPG I've played in the past few years, for better or for worse. Like Mass Effect 2, Dragon Age 2 takes a major departure from the traditional structure and presentation of its predecessor to deliver a more cinematic, action-focused experience. In some ways, it succeeds. Much of Dragon Age 2 comes across as an interactive TV series more than it does a game, particularly when you factor in how completely uninspired, repetitive, and obnoxious the actual playing of the game can be. To that end, it steals even more from the Mass Effect playbook. Instead of an unvoiced player character with a long list of responses to choose from, Dragon Age 2 features a fully voiced main character guided by a conversation wheel. The wheel supports three sorts of responses to a given situation: a diplomatic and kind response, a cruel and aggressive response, and a flippant mercenary response for the middle of the wheel. It's actually a pretty big improvement over Mass Effect, whose middle conversation option was always so bland and non-committal. There, you're either Paragon or you're Renegade. Choosing the middle response is purposeless. Here in Dragon Age 2, the middle response is possibly the best of the three at times, allowing you to agree to more things without being sycophantic about it, and get paid for more things without being thuggish about it. Both good and evil playthroughs are made more dynamic by dipping into the third option from time to time. That's one of the experiments that works. There are still parts of the game, though, pretty big parts, that are awful. Yet there are an almost equal number of things about Dragon Age 2 that it does quite uniquely and brilliantly. Origins was a closed-world game, but it had many different parts to it, a whole kingdom to explore and a whole culture to get to know, even if the majority of the kingdom didn't exist outside of your conceptualization of it. This game tightens that focus dramatically. You spend pretty much the entirety of the game in Kirkwall, a city-state in the Free Marches that was once a slave-trading hub of the Tevinter Imperium, and its immediate surroundings. To make this game last 40 hours in such a limited environment, they break the game into 3 acts separated by 3 years each, defining the player's journey not by the amount of kingdom saved, but by the ramifications of your actions and attitudes over time. That's the most interesting aspect of this game's design, and it's most successful in terms of making the script work. It's about Hawke, the player character, whose first name and class you choose, but whose person is already mostly predefined. Hawke's rise to power as the champion of Kirkwall is slow, and as such, more human and believable than most player stories in RPGs. But it goes hand in hand with the worst, most complained about part of Dragon Age 2, the fact that you'll play through every single map in the game at least 3 times, many more times than that for the cave map. Instead of having unique environments for every area, or close to every area like Origins, not only will you play through every map once per act, including the general city areas, but combat is paced in waves, so that once you begin combat, it's not just the enemies you see, more are continually spawned until the waves are over. All combat in Dragon Age 2 is like this. It's time-consuming and repetitious. It's also good-looking and fun, which is where the money went as far as combat goes. Any individual combat encounter is much more fluid and fast-paced than anything in Origins. It sacrifices a lot of the most tactical elements of Origins, however, to get that way, and the game does away with the eye-in-the-sky isometric perspective entirely, locking you into what they hope will be a more visceral-seeming third-person over-the-shoulder view. The animations really are amazing, and the look of the combat is top-notch. Out of any party-based RPG, the fighting in Dragon Age 2 is my pick as the most fun to watch. There's plenty of strategy in the game's combat, sure, but fundamentally the main purpose of the combat is spectacle. You're chaining together a bunch of cool-looking shit, and when the chaining is through, another 4 minutes of game time will have passed. That's the problem. Combat encounters are placed at extremely frequent and extremely predictable intervals during every single quest, and every single quest is crammed into a tiny handful of environments. Like the combat, Taken individually, the environments are very interesting and engaging. The architecture radiates with the passage of time, the sense of being only one chapter of an unbelievably long history of suffering in this place. The two main outdoor maps are quite scenic and interesting, their moods clearly defined, but there's only one map for caves. They just start you off in different parts of the cave, sealing off or opening up different sections of one large map and hoping you don't notice. You might not notice up to your third time, but every player will have noticed by their 15th. There's only one Darktown interior map, one warehouse map, one mountain map, one coastal map, and Dragon Age 2 is a game with dozens and dozens and dozens of quests. If the vast majority of those quests are fluffed up by lengthy combat encounters, and they are, you're looking at clearing that warehouse 6 different times at 15 minutes ago with only slightly different enemies. An hour and a half of straight warehousing. Fuck that. Dragon Age 2 has a lot more collectible items and quests than Origins also, and the pursuit of those collectibles compels the player to investigate every nook and cranny of every map every time. No matter if it's the same actual map, it counts as a different place in its intent, so it has new items you have to hunt for all over again. It's infuriating, and it makes it impossible to just breeze past through these recycled areas if you're trying for a robust, thorough playthrough. It's just padding for time. The thing is, if they didn't pad the time out like that, the feeling of time passing in the narrative for Hawke, the sensation that Hawke really lives in Kirkwall, would be less significant. But they could have found a way to do it that didn't so severely tax the player's patience. These are complaints about Dragon Age 2 that are pretty much universal, and BioWare took them to heart. The website for Dragon Age 3 makes its lack of reused environments a major selling point, further mentioning that, quote, one map in Dragon Age 3 is larger than all the maps in Dragon Age 2. Good for Dragon Age 3, bad for Dragon Age 2. As difficult as it is to get on board with so many of the technical decisions that went into the game, it's much easier to get sucked into your role as Hawke. Dragon Age 2 opens about a third of the way through the main campaign of Origins, when the Darkspawn destroy Lothering and the refugees start fleeing Ferelden by the thousands. You and your family are among those refugees, starting from zero with nothing to lose. Your mother was once part of a noble estate in Kirkwall before she left to marry your father, an apostate. Your sister Bethany is an apostate as well, and your brother Carver is a soldier. Together, you must flee Ferelden to Kirkwall to escape the Blight and seek your fortune. Unlike any other game that BioWare has made, though, BioWare 2 is less about how much power Hawke acquires over the course of the game and more about how little power Hawke really has in Kirkwall. It's about family, consequence, and the chaotic threads of fate. First, family and consequence. Not all of you are going to make it to Kirkwall. An ogre attacks Hawke and company as they make their way closer to the Kokari Wilds, killing Carver if you're a warrior or rogue, or killing Bethany if you're a mage. You defeat the ogre, but it's no use. Your sibling is dead, and you're soon to follow as the horde closes in. Then fate. Flemeth, Morrigan's mother, swoops down to save you, intrigued by your defeat of the ogre. This is before the Warden kills her in the original campaign, and she's already anticipating Morrigan asking the Warden to do it. She alone deems you worthy to be saved, sees the potential for true power within you. She only asks that you take a locket with you when you cross the ocean and one day perform a ritual with it on Sundermount, near Kirkwall. The design differences between Flemeth and Origins and here is insane. In Origins, she's an old woman in rags who's sometimes also a dragon. Here she's a rock and roll demigod in full mythic sorceress regalia. All of the character designs in Dragon Age 2 are more stylized, from enemies to the racial construction of NPCs, but this is pretty over the top. We'll talk about why that might be when we talk about Varric. So your journey to Kirkwall, and when you get there, you're denied entry. Too many refugees. Your family name no longer means anything, your uncle having sold the estate to cover some of his vast debt. It's an intriguing way to start off an adventure, clamoring for scraps and banking on the hope that someone will help. Someone will, if you pledge yourself to their service for a year without pay. A serf. After that year, portrayed in a stylish little cutscene, is where your adventures begin in earnest, at the very bottom of a very high social ladder. In a lot of ways, Dragon Age 2 could never be as epic of an experience as Origins, simply because they made the player too powerless to play at that level. But that ends up being the most refreshing thing about the whole game. In the first act, you're trying to come up with enough funds to buy partnership in an expedition to the Deep Roads, where hopefully you can make a name for yourself and a tidy fortune besides. As you meet your companions and get to know Kirkwall through the quests you do, it feels incredibly natural and fluid. You have concrete personal reasons for everything you do and everywhere you go. It feels like the first act of something grand. The sensation just oozes out of the writing. Now, the other major criticism leveled against the game is that all of these choices you're making are fundamentally meaningless, that the game never returns to or satisfactorily resolves many of your decisions, that the climax is so on rails that it saps the meaning of whatever came before it. I don't necessarily agree. It's true that many of the choices you make are never addressed again, but that misses the intent of the game. Where Origins established the world of Dragon Age as a place, familiarized you with the conflicts and its politics, gave you all the textbook stuff about the world, Dragon Age 2 is all about the people, the active culture, and the experience of actually living in the world. This game more satisfactorily addresses what it would be like to be a real citizen of a fantasy world better than any RPG I've ever played, actually, Skyrim included, or perhaps Skyrim especially. And that's directly because of how it handles plot over time, and how, in many cases, the machinations of plot are taken out of the player's hands entirely. In my actual experience of living, most things you do have to be worth it just for the actual doing of them. I live with no real guarantee that anything I do in life will yield returns down the line, no real right to have my choices be the final outcome of a situation. That's how it is in this game. Each quest you resolve has to be its own reward. The goal of finishing the quest has to be your increased understanding of the world and the increased personal definition of your version of Hawke. In this way, each act is relatively distinct. Some of your choices may bleed through, but few of them will directly play into the climax. You're not the Grey Warden. The fate of the kingdom isn't in your hands. All you can do is steer your personal destiny as best you can with the information that's available to you. I found this exciting and highly engaging. Many players find it irritating. If you're in this camp, I recommend trying to roleplay simply for the pleasure of playing a role, without expectation of your choices to have definitive in-game meaning. It's how the narrative functions best when you factor in all the deficiencies of the game's technical construction. The second act has the player acting under the direction of the Viscount of Kirkwall to ease tensions between the several hundred-strong Qunari population of the city and, well, the entire rest of the city. In Origins, Sten was mostly what you got as far as understanding the Qunari goes. Here you interact with their society much, much more closely. Sten was a fantastically defined individual, but according to the Qun, he is only the Sten. The Qun, the teachings that all Qunari follow, is simple but very foreign and unyielding. It posits that all things have a natural place and purpose, and the decision to yield to and embrace that purpose is the basis of morality. To deny what you are obviously suited to do is a struggle against the self and the world, needless and wasteful. As such, Qunari are raised according to profession, without family ties, with no value put on emotional bonds. Qunari can feel as many emotions as they want to, but they must abide by their duty and destiny, or else be rejected by the Qun. Those ejected are called the Valshoth, or Tal Valshoth, and they are truly and irredeemably lost, according to the Qun. They're creatures who aren't defined by their actions, they're predefined by their roles. A Qunari will always act predictably if you have a grasp of the Qun. Here in Kirkwall, Hawke struggles with the will of the Arishok, who must stay in Kirkwall until he finds a missing object as dictated by his duties as Arishok. The more years he stays in Kirkwall, the less he can accept the way of it. Conflict is inevitable. No one truly wants it, but the Qun is not a negotiable philosophy. It's a compelling philosophy for many, though, especially the elves, whose culture has been formless and undefined for hundreds of years. When two elves accused of murder submit themselves to the Qun, the Arishok allows them the opportunity to take their place in Qunari society. It is just, it is allowed, so it must be. For the politics of Kirkwall, it is unacceptable. The Arishok knows this. Understanding doesn't dictate action, however. It is the Qun that dictates action. So regardless of how much respect he has for Hawke personally, the Arishok lays siege to the city to bring it into alignment with what the Qun demands it to be. You can make so many decisions regarding how you treat the Arishok, how you treat the Qunari, but your choices don't matter. Only the Qun matters, and its outcome is already known. At the end of Act 2, Kirkwall will burn. That's that. To many, this is unsatisfactory role-playing, but I do like its narrative integrity. The third act revolves around the issue that Dragon Age 2 comes back to again and again throughout its entire length. The end of the balance of cooperation between the Templars and the Mages. Knight Commander Meredith is a zealot who, over the course of the game, becomes increasingly severe in the measures she'll take to keep the mages under her thumb. Mages, feeling the pressure, increasingly turn to blood magic as their only alternative to outright persecution and imprisonment. This creates a downward spiral of mistrust and rebellion that the player is continually caught up in throughout the game. There are well-meaning Templars and Mages on both sides of the issue, but time and again those acting out of kindness fall victim to the destructive power of the situation. Your family falls victim to it. In one of the game's most memorable subplots, you catch wind of a serial killer in Kirkwall. In the first act, he disappears, and then comes back for the second act. His calling card is to send his victims a bouquet of white flowers the day before he kills them. Your mother receives such a bouquet one day. As you pursue the killer, you come across a portrait of a woman who looks a lot like her, the killer's deceased wife. Using blood magic, the killer has recreated his dead wife from pieces of the living. Your mom provided the face. That's a straight fucked up moment of video gaming, one of the most shocking and personal confrontations in the game, certainly. It's an amazing scene, followed by a very boring, repetitive combat sequence like you'd been doing for 20 minutes before the twist, and then back to being an amazing scene. Such is Dragon Age 2. Anyway, that's only the most personal affront to Hawke by rogue mages. As Meredith's restraint wanes, even mages who you've helped can come back and betray you in a bid for liberation. At the end of Act 3, you'll have to make a choice. Dragon Age 2 spends much of its duration making that choice complicated for you. It's this slow boil of disparate plot elements over time that really makes the narrative shine, and it's how the game gives its characters the slow boil treatment that the strength of the design choice really manifests. The entire game is actually anchored by one of your companions, Varric. Varric is literally telling the story of Hawke, the champion of Kirkwall, to a woman named Cassandra Pendergast. Cassandra is a seeker for the Chantry, and she's interrogating him to better understand the circumstances that throw the world into such disarray at the end of the game. To put it another way, Dragon Age 2 basically takes place directly before the events of Dragon Age 3. The entire game is a flashback leading up to these upcoming events. Cassandra's even been confirmed as one of the party companions of Dragon Age 3. This gives the game a very important subtext, namely that it's set up to a larger conflict. Many of the events and quests in Dragon Age 2 seem to be just passing through, not necessarily the beginning, not just the end, just setup. That's because much of it is, more than I realized when the game first came out and before so much was revealed about Dragon Age 3. In any case, Varric frames the game perfectly. He's a golden-hearted scoundrel, certainly cliché, but the voice work is pretty flawless. Varric presents well, even if he is just a stylized, specific to Dragon Age version of a very old kind of character. The framing device also informs how stylized everything in the game is, from character to costume. Why is Flemeth dressed like a geriatric battle dominatrix in this game when she was just an old woman in Origins? That's because Varric is inclined to describe her that way. Flemeth has many names, many versions of her story, many descriptions of her person. No one knows for sure exactly what's true. What we do know is that Varric likes action, he likes to exaggerate, and he likes it when things get flashy. Flemeth in this game is Varric's Flemeth, as Flemeth in Origin was Morrigan's Flemeth. I'll bet you dollars to donuts you won't be expecting how Flemeth shows up in the third game. You can play this game pretty straightforwardly, but the writers had a very thorough vision for how they wanted this framing device to manifest for the player. Varric is also the only character who doesn't really change much over the events of the Champion's rise to power. He mostly acts as a kind of team coach or possibly mascot for the rest of the characters, helping them along, assisting their journeys. Varric tells the stories. He prefers not to be the star of them. The only character to be with Hawke for the entire journey is Aveline, whom you meet while you're still trying to flee Ferelden. Her husband, a Templar named Wesley, is mortally wounded and has to be left behind. Aveline is one of the most slightly progressive female characters in gaming, and her character's arc is one of the most charming to bear witness to. At the beginning of the game, she's like you, a survivor, a refugee, a nobody. Aveline's a woman of intensely strong convictions, though, and in short order finds herself amongst the city guard. In the first act, you help her put a stop to the corruption plaguing the guard. The Seneschal then promotes Aveline to captain of the guard, partly for public relations, partly because of Aveline's obvious ability. She steps into the boots quite well. Aveline is a woman of absolutely steadfast personal integrity, and she comes off that way. Her sense of duty is in the whole of her being, but it is the core. It what makes her the happiest and keeps her the sanest. So, the second act has you helping her in the disastrous process of dating now that years have passed since Wesley's death. She is very, very bad at it. Not because she has to sacrifice her femininity to her job, but because she's practical and serious and totally uncomfortable with these fuzzy moments. Aveline's both straightforward and complex, making her one of the most solid foundations of the supporting cast. Bethany, the sibling companion for most characters, is also with you from the very beginning, but she's not very likely to make it to the end. At the end of Act 1, you venture into a lost Taiga of the Dwarves, sealed off for centuries even before the first Blight. Down there you'll find an idol of pure lyrium, but a strange sort of raw red lyrium that speaks to Varric's brother and coerces him to seal you in the Taig and take the idol for himself. In your time there, Bethany, or Carver if you're a mage, will become sick with the taint. Your mother begged you not to take your sibling, not to risk losing them, yet here you are. If you have Anders, a returning companion from Awakening, with you, then he can bring Bethany to a group of Grey Wardens who induct her into the Order. You don't see her again outside the Legacy DLC and the very ends of Acts 2 and 3. Her life is the Warden's from then on. At first, she'll hate you for it, but as the years pass, she'll warm to her duty, to how maybe you did save her life instead of taking it away. If you never took her on the expedition, she'll be imprisoned by the Templars while you're away, where she'll stay until the events of the third act bring you together one last time. Giving the player a family, a dynamic, well-written family like this, is one of the player's strongest connections to the plot and the narrative. It's a story on a deeply personal scale, so it needs to be populated with deeply personal concerns. Meryl, the Elven Mage Companion, ties the game to origins in unexpected ways. She's a member of the Dalish tribe from the Dalish origin story of the first game. You can actually see her in the scene with Duncan and the mirror way back in this video. She looked a lot different then, didn't have the accent. Her arc revolves around the shattered Illuvion used to find Morrigan and Witch Hunt. It's the same tribe from Origins that now resides on Sundermount, the same keeper and everything, and they brought the mirror. Meryl is obsessed with repairing it, despite Keeper Meratheri's strong objections. She's an interesting character, but hard to get along with, obnoxious in her naivete from time to time. Plus, her arc really fizzles out at the end. The Illuvion promises to be a major thread tying the events of Origins to its sequel, maybe even to the third game, but it isn't to be. It ends up being all about Meryl. A demon was waiting to possess her the minute she finished work on the mirror, so the Keeper allowed the demon to possess her first to spare Meryl the indignity. It's a real flat note. It's clearly meant to be heart-wrenching, but it's hard to forgive them for letting the mirror be a red herring, and Meryl was prepared to pay that price herself. Another character that fell flat for me was Fenris, an escaped slave of the Tevinter Imperium with mystical tattoos and a tragic past. So tragic. Fenris might not be the most cliché of the companions, Isabella gets that honor, but he is the most obnoxious of them by a mile. Of course, I'm not in the right demographic for him either. It took me a while to realize that the specific configuration of clichés that make up Fenris are meant to come across as compelling and romantic. I'm supposed to think that this elf is a big old dreamboat. After years of playing games with poorly written female characters just there to appeal to the sexual expectations of stereotypical male gamers, I was surprised by how irritating it was to interact with a poorly written male character just there to appeal to the sexual expectations of stereotypical female gamers. No wonder gaming has a reputation of being unappealing to women. If marketers felt like all male characters should be more like Fenris to sell games to women, I would shit a brick in anger. Why should women put up with shallow writing and anger-inducing characterization in female characters just because marketers feel women should be portrayed in a certain way to appeal to men? From his anime-influenced character design to his stoically wounded self-presentation, Fenris is there as a romantic companion first and foremost, but not one I give a damn about. It's too bad that Fenris is such a cliché because I was surprised how interesting it was for the shoe to be on the other foot as far as gender tropes go. Let's talk about Isabella then, if we're talking about what marketers feels appeals to men. She's a busty, bisexual pirate queen who drinks, fights, and fucks in equal measure. She likes double entendres and double brandy shooters. Jesus. She's just as much a pile of clichés as Fenris is, but at least she's upbeat about it. It's hard to defend her as a meaningful character in the game, but I will defend her as meaningful comic relief. I think the writers knew damn well how totally over-the-top Isabella is, so they wrote dozens of pretty hilarious pop-cultural references for her in place of character development. Familiarity with Sir Mix-a-Lot hasn't been critical for Dragon Age up until this point, but Isabella makes it so. She gets brought into the plot with the Canaria's missing artifact, namely that she is the one who stole the missing artifact, but other than that, she's pretty tangential to the plot. I ended up playing through Isabella's romance arc because I apparently do represent my demographic, and the only really interesting thing about it is that Isabella continually puts herself first in the relationship, and I like that. There's no reason to give her a heart of gold all of a sudden, she just tried to take it out and pawn it. It's worth pointing out also that Dragon Age 2's sex scenes don't take themselves as seriously as the ones in Origin, and that takes a lot of the stupid out of them, too. They actually integrate themselves pretty well into the cable TV aesthetic that the whole game has going for it. There's another companion in the $7.50 DLC called the Exiled Prince. For that price, you get Sebastian, who you may be surprised to learn is an exiled prince. Sebastian's a little hard to categorize, and I'm at a loss to say if you actually need to spend money on his DLC. His arc is also quite cliché, but much more functional and meaningful within the framework of the greater conflicts of Dragon Age. Sebastian's a member of the Chantry. His family is murdered, so he leaves the Chantry and swears revenge. Eventually, after you help him with all that murderer stuff, he struggles to choose between embracing his claim to the throne of Starkhaven or returning to his life of religious contemplation, which is more fulfilling to him than ruling ever was. As a character, he's not really very likable. He's self-serious and pompous, putting on a humble front but abandoning it when challenged. His arc is boring, but having the Exiled Prince as part of your Dragon Age 2 experience adds a lot, and that it expands the narrative threads with Grand Cleric Althena. If there was ever to be a peaceful solution to the conflict between mages and Templars, it would be through Althena. She's a very well-drawn character, unwilling to be a zealot for her beliefs, committed to the Maker on a personal and social level. When members of her church aggress against the Qunari, she refuses to stand by them. When Meredith wants to bring the Templars crashing down on the mages, Althena rebukes her. Althena is a voice of compassion, reason, and faith, a third way out for the final act's conflict. Sebastian and her are also quite close, and she's a much larger part of the game with his DLC active, which improves the narrative considerably. So, I think it's borderline bullshit that such an important character to the main campaign was downplayed in the main campaign just so she could be made more robust by the application of $7.50. When I think about what's predatory and problematic about DLC in general, this content springs to mind. Finally, let's talk about Anders. Anders is arguably the most important character in the game, since the climax is triggered as much by his actions as by any of yours. Honestly, you could say that it's Hawke's willingness to even be friends with Anders that takes Kirkwall past the brink of disaster as much as anything else. In Awakening, Anders was warm, kind, and occasionally a little irreverent. He had no love of the Templars, but didn't think there was any way for mages to truly break from the Chantry without causing more suffering than it would alleviate. Then he let Justice merge with him, became a kind of unusual abomination. When Justice's fixed black and white personality blended with Anders, he became Vengeance. The injustices and cruelties of the mortal world are too much to tolerate for Vengeance, feeling them with the keenness of Anders' emotional sensitivity. Justice could not be more or less than Justice. Vengeance is what he is. Over the course of the game, you'll see Anders gradually lose his own personality to the hybrid. Vengeance has a plan. With Anders' magical knowledge, he will set some sort of magical charge that will destroy the Kirkwall Chantry, in his own words, removing the possibility of compromise. Grand Cleric Althena's third way of compassion and compromise is just as offensive to Vengeance as the Templars' outright oppression. For a spirit of the Fate, there is no middle ground. It is or it is not. Anders lies to Hawke, uses Hawke to fulfill the plan. This is another lightning rod for major plot criticism, that the player is totally powerless against this twist. Even if you don't help Anders, he blows the Chantry right the fuck up. It's not a twist you're supposed to want, unless you're a strong mage sympathizer, but it's the twist the writers decided they wanted. I said before that Dragon Age 2's framing device indicated that it was primarily a setup for Dragon Age 3, and the climax is proof of that. All your choices are swept up into an unavoidable confrontation between Knight Commander Meredith and First Enchanter Orsino. Orsino is a reasonable elf. He just wants to be treated like a man, not a monster, and he'll compromise anything if Meredith will stop her paranoid crusade, but Meredith, unhinged, will not. Then Anders blows up the Chantry. Meredith immediately calls for the right of annulment, demanding that the Templars slay all the mages in Kirkwall immediately. Hawke must pick a side and decide what to do with Anders. It's actually a very well done scene, but many people hate it because it's so relatively disconnected from the choices they'd spent the whole game making. BioWare needed this moment to happen in the universe of Dragon Age, though, so it's gonna. This is the thing that Cassandra Pendergast wants Varric to help her understand. How could this happen? Who is responsible? Varric himself is at a loss to say what individual straw broke the camel's back, just that there were many straws, and Hawke placed the majority of them on the camel. The Templars assault the mages in the gallows, the former Tevinter prison that the mages are kept in. After the initial assault, many mages lie dead, and Orsino snaps. He uses blood magic to make himself a monster from the corpses of those he swore to protect. It's poetic, but pretty dumb. He really didn't have to. Hawke was handling it just fine, and the guy could have had a little bit more patience. The next dumb thing is Meredith's sword. You see, it was forged from the same lyrium idol that was brought to the surface at the end of Act 1. It's been intensifying her paranoia, driving her to ignore compromise. Really, so much of the character development and foreshadowing in the game is there to justify taking the reins of the plot away from the player, removing a peaceful resolution. Making Meredith magically crazy pretty much guarantees it, but it's an awfully cheap way to strengthen the narrative. In time, news of the events in Kirkwall spread across the world, shattering the stability of peace between mages and the Chantry. It's open rebellion, total instability. The Templars would even break away from the Chantry to more single-mindedly pursue an anti-mage agenda. This is the political climate the Dragon Age Inquisition will begin in. Hawke's role in shaping that political reality, and the sense of depth that Dragon Age 2 brings to the setting of Dragon Age at large, are both quite meaningful, but by the time you get to the end of Dragon Age 2, you're going to be very ready for it. With its slick but repetitive gameplay, cinematic but relatively unreactive plot, and highly stylized cast of characters, I can't help but question the wisdom in making this a game at all. Dragon Age 2 is a game that revels in the flourishes of modern cable TV serials, and it feels like it would have been better that way. As a 40-hour game, I was often bored and frustrated in the playing of it. As a 24-episode TV season at 45 minutes an episode, it would have held my interest throughout. Tonight, on The Champion of Kirkwall. Oh well. Despite its mixed reception, Dragon Age 2 received 2 major pieces of DLC that follow Hawke on 2 very different adventures in places far away from Kirkwall. The first DLC is Mark of the Assassin, which begins as a heist at an Orlesian noble's mountain estate and ends by fleshing out the player's understanding of the Qunari's role in Dragon Age. The elf Talus, voiced by Felicia Day, who also played Talus on a short Dragon Age video web series, asks Hawke to help her steal an important artifact from the dastardly Duke Prosper. You have to earn the Duke's respect by participating in a mountainside wyvern hunt, then infiltrate his party, then sneak in a lengthy but shallow sneaking segment into his vault. All that is just a red herring, though. What Talus is actually after is a list of names of every one of the Free Marches who follows the Qun. Talus herself isn't truly named Talus. Like Sten, Talus is a Qunari title and job description. Talus is a rank of Ben Hasrith, the arm of Qunari that conducts espionage, diplomacy, and polices the people of the Qun. When the main campaign touches on the idea of the Qun as a life's philosophy that anyone can join if they're willing to submit to its unbending authority, here, you'll really get a taste of what that looks like, to be an outsider on the inside. Talus is very interesting because she's adept at understanding the culture of those outside the Qun, having been part of it herself for most of her life, so she's able to parse the demands of the Qun in a way that's more accessible, easier to grasp. Mark of the Assassin is a goofy heist that's great fun on one level, but on the other level, its purpose is to cement your idea of the Qunari as a religion more than a race. You don't need horns to be a valued member. The other DLC is Legacy, and it's probably my favorite part of the entire Dragon Age 2 experience. It's a fantastic adventure, for one, and for another, its conclusion has some amazing ramifications to the mythological history of Dragon Age. In Legacy, you follow the trail left by mercenaries who have been coming after you of late to their hideout deep within the desert wilderness. They want your blood, or rather, they want the blood of anyone connected to your father. As you fight your way into the hideout, the reason becomes clear. The hideout is on top of an ancient Grey Warden prison, slowly crumbling to dust in an offshoot of the Deep Roads. Your father was recruited by the Wardens to use blood magic to reinforce the ancient wards of the prison. He did so, but something terrible within the prison is reaching out into the minds of those who happen by. Those with a taint in their blood, like Bethany or Carver if they're a Grey Warden, or Anders, are especially susceptible to this call. It's like the call of the Archdemon, but different. The prison itself is gorgeous. Legacy is so much better looking than most of the main campaign. In fact, it's a little insulting that so much effort and money went into these 2 DLCs, which are still only sold individually for $10 apiece, when BioWare couldn't even be bothered to make 2 sorts of caves for the main campaign. It is stunning, though. The level design of the dungeon is pretty solid. It's more of a traditional dungeon crawl than any other part of Dragon Age 2. It's comparable to the golems of Amgarak that way, but much easier. Plus, there's a lot of little minor quests and tiny distractions as you make your way through the prison, and it's so good to get out of Kirkwall for a while and see some really ancient shit in a Dragon Age game. Archaeological fascination was a powerful motivator in Origins. It's a shame that that motivation doesn't show up much in Dragon Age 2. Legacy almost makes up for it, though. But let's talk about the star of Legacy. The creature trapped in the prison is a darkspawn named Corypheus. Like the Architect, his flesh is a tangled mass, mixed with stone and metal, twisted and angry. But he's no regular darkspawn. He's original flavor. Corypheus is one of the ancient Tevinter mages who first set foot in the Maker's Golden City, poisoning it, bringing the taint to our world. Corypheus says that the city was black and foul when they arrived, though. Perseus has been in stasis within the prison for centuries. He doesn't really realize how much time has passed. While he figures things out, he'll speak with you about it. It's an awesome moment in the series' lore. Anders, if you brought him along, will be flabbergasted by it. The Maker's Golden City was supposed to be a chantry myth, propaganda to paint the mages in a bad light. Up until now, there was never much concrete proof given to the player about it at all. But here the proof is now, walking and talking, one of the first Darkspawn ever to come into being. If there's any plot thread in the DLC of Dragon Age 2 that Dragon Age 3 will pick up on, my bet's on this one. So what exactly can we expect from Dragon Age 3 Inquisition? Well, we can look forward to a continuation of the cinematic presentation of the second game. Dialogue will return, as will the dynamic, action-oriented quality of the scene construction, but it'll have a much more open-world approach than either of its predecessors. BioWare has publicly stated their admiration for Skyrim's brilliant open-world design, and Inquisition will feel Skyrim's influence quite heavily. In making much larger environments, the upcoming game is trying to add to the sense of player-driven exploration that Skyrim succeeds at so effortlessly and has been so difficult to come by in a Dragon Age game so far. It'll follow many of the plot threads of Origins, the Illuvion, the place beyond the Fade, Flemeth. Really, Flemeth only shows up in Dragon Age 2 at all on her way to this upcoming game. Hawke is needed to bring her back into the world after the Warden kills her, and that's it. The Darkspawn will no doubt feature much more heavily in this upcoming game as well, as will the Fade. From Dragon Age 2, Inquisition will draw more on the political circumstances generated by the climax, the collapse of the Mages' Circles, the cessation of the Templars from the Chantry, the death of the Qunari Arishok, the mission of Eric's Interrogator. You can't call ahead of time exactly what will or what won't show up, but based on what's been revealed so far, Inquisition looks like the game that both Origins and Dragon Age 2 have been building towards. A sprawling epic where your character has vast political power, bolstered by your player experience with Origins world building, and Dragon Age 2's cultural immersion in the world that they've created. I'm unbelievably impressed with BioWare's commitment to the long con with these games. If you play them in preparation for this upcoming game, keep an eye out for how much foreshadowing there is, because it's everywhere. BioWare wants Dragon Age to be the next great American fantasy series, and if they're going the directions it looks like they're going, I don't see any reason why not to give them the title. Each of these games are real successes at their chosen format, even Dragon Age 2 to a certain extent. What's exciting about Dragon Age 3 is that it has the potential to be a real unified field theory of Western role-playing. If it can actually combine what's exciting about Skyrim, the exploration, the open world, what's really interesting about Origins, the sort of traditional tactical role-playing, and what's really exciting about Dragon Age 2, which is the visceral cinematic storytelling, you have the potential for a real runaway hit, and at the very beginning of the next console generation, it's positioned very well to be quite well remembered. I'm excited to play it, and I'm excited to share it with you when I do. Thanks for watching.